And we're live.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone who's joined us today and everyone who is joining us virtually for a briefing of the police work group to address police reform and accountability, and today we are hearing from the Maryland State's Attorneys Association. We will be hearing from State's Attorney Rich Gibson from Howard County, State's Attorney Aisha Braveboy from Prince George's County, and State's Attorney John McCarthy from Montgomery County, and then we will hear from the State's Attorney from Baltimore City, Marilyn Mosby, and then representatives from the Office of the Public Defender. I'll just remind the members, if you have a question, please let me know in the chat, or you can send me a text if you like. And with that, I will go ahead and let State's Attorney Rich Gibson from the amazing Howard County take it away.
Am I live now?
Yes, we are.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Delegate Alberry. Truly appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to address this esteemed body on this particularly important topic. My name is Rich Gibson. I'm the State's Attorney for Howard County, and I'm honored to be here representing the Maryland State's Attorneys Association. We recognize that we're here today to offer our testimony and insights because the nation and our state, quite frankly, are at an inflection point. We are moved by, sympathize with, and empathize with the suffering and frustration people feel over the loss of life that occurs all too frequently due to negative interactions with law enforcement. We feel it's our obligation as elected officials charged with ensuring equal, fair, and just enforcement of our laws that we speak out and offer sensible, sustainable reforms that address the issues which undermine members of our community's faith in the criminal justice institutions that are designed to protect and serve them. We understand there's a lot of concepts and ideas being explored, and we wanted to offer some concepts that we thought were sustainable and sensible that address the issues without undermining the safety that exists for our communities, right? We believe that we can do this, and so we've gotten together and tried to address these issues. The membership of the Msaa is comprised of 24 elected officials from across the state. They're all state's attorneys. We reflect the diversity that is Maryland. There are 10 Democrats, 14 Republicans, women, men, people of different races, representing rural, urban, and suburban regions of our state. We have different perspectives. Some of us have been elected officials running prosecutorial offices for over a decade, like Charlie Smith in Frederick County, or my colleague who we heard from today, John McCarthy. Others have extensive legislative experience, like my colleague who we heard from today, Aisha Braveboy. Others, like myself, are new to leading prosecutorial offices, but we have been career prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions, and we have extensive actual courtroom experience. We're not going to see, and we don't see every issue the same way. And we all have an abiding respect for the vast majority of the law enforcement officers who protect our community and sometimes risk their lives in order to do so. In order to preserve the trust we have and to regain the trust we have lost, we recognize the need to act. Therefore, the Msaa came together and formed the Committee for Prosecutorial and Police Reforms, which I had the honor of chairing. We had several meetings, which had really robust discussion. And in the end, we were able to agree on 12 recommendations, which were shared with this body. Those recommendations, many of them were unanimous, some of them were not. But all recommendations that were shared with the committee are positions that were bipartisan and reflected the will of each of us to some degree or another. And it really embodied change that we think will affect the community in a positive way and at the same time ensure safety. There are some alternative suggestions that are out right now that I thought it'd be important to address. One of those is defund the police. There's an argument that says that police should be actually defunded. And I think nomenclature matters because there's also people who share that belief who aren't talking about actually defunding the police, but are rather talking about reprioritizing how our tax dollars are spent. I can tell you that it's a prosecutor's job to look evil in the face every day. We see man's inhumanity to man on full display in full HD on a constant basis. And we appreciate that the dedicated, hardworking police force exists to interrupt a society that if they weren't there, could quickly devolve into a might makes right world where, domestic violence and rape and child abuse go unchecked. And, that's not hyperbole. That's just what we see in the course of our obligations. And so we do appreciate the role police play. And if they are actually defunded, it would be disastrous. It would have a disastrous effect. If you want to have a discussion about reprioritization of funding, that's a conversation we are willing to have in Howard County, my esteemed county, and Delegate Alberry's esteemed county. We already sort of done that. If you look at the way we prioritize our funding, for every dollar that's taken in taxes in Howard County, 62 cents of that goes to education and 12 cents goes to public safety. And that 12 cents is divided in public safety amongst the state attorney's office, the sheriff's office, our police, our fire, our emergency management. But again, if there's a conversation that the legislature wants to have related to repartition of funds, it's something that we would love to take part in. But actually defunding the police would be a horrible, catastrophic idea. Another idea that's been discussed, I think, would lead to some negative consequences is the removal of qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is when certain actors, it's a concept in tort law. Certain actors, police, prosecutors, the legislature enjoy it, engage in any action within the scope of their official duties. They are immune from civil suits for that action. So by way, in terms of a legislative example, if the legislature passed a bill that said you couldn't sell alcohol after 5 p.m. on Mondays, the people who voted for that bill would not be exposed to civil suit from the alcohol distributors, the bars, the restaurant owners, et cetera, for the loss in revenue because of the bill that they passed in their official duties. And you can see why it makes sense in that context and why it makes sense in a police context, because it would create a chilling effect on your ability to act. The legislative members would not enact laws if they were going to be personally held liable for the negative consequence of those laws. And they basically would be frozen in place. They wouldn't engage in any action. Furthermore, not many people would line up to become members of the legislature if they knew they were risking their child's college education or their ability to pay their mortgage by doing so. And so we in a police context, and I've tried police involved shooting cases. I've handled police involved shooting cases. And in my current role as state's attorney, I evaluate police involved shooting cases. I can tell you that law enforcement are responding to situations that evolve extremely rapidly. And they often have to make decisions that have momentous impact based upon seconds, sometimes milliseconds of information that they're having to collect, analyze, and respond to. Additionally, the harsh light of hindsight, the ability to, when you're looking at and evaluating police conduct from a remote position, from a distant position where you're not exposed to any danger, it can really lead to distortions in evaluations of judgment. And so for that reason, I think that the chilling effect that it would have would be too great. And I think removing qualified immunity would be a bad concept. Now, I'd like to talk about 3 concepts that we proposed in our recommendations that I think have broad support. One is body-worn camera. Body-worn camera is a phenomenal tool. It's not a panacea. It doesn't solve every problem, but it would lead to greater transparency. It would lead to greater trust, and it would lead to a better tool in evaluating police conduct when interacting with the community. And it would obviously be a way of capturing misconduct if police engage in it on the part of the police, or misconduct on the community if they engage in it. It's a great tool, but one of the misconceptions about body-worn camera that it's a police thing. It is, but it comes with great prosecutorial cost, right? So it's expensive. Great tool, but expensive. We support it. We believe that it should be statewide, but we want to make sure that the funds are appropriated to do it properly. The actual cost at the SAO level can be quite high, right? It actually body-worn camera will have a minor impact on caseload. Yes, you'll have some cases where you find police doing things that are wrong. We might prosecute those police for those things. And so you'll have some buildup in prosecutions of cases, but the caseload will be the same. What changes is the workload. And that's because body-worn camera will generate evidence that we have to process as prosecutors. We have an obligation, a legal obligation, to inform defense of any information that we believe exonerates them, that we have unique access to, and any information we have that we want to use in order to show that they are guilty at trial. Those are your Brady obligations. Body-worn camera expands that world of evidence exponentially. Our office would have to screen, redact, review, transfer to defense counsel or the defendants in the case, present at trial, and then store the evidence for the required retention period. In Howard County, our attention periods, we follow the circuit court schedule. And so it's for any case involving a sentence of 20 years or less, we have to keep that information for 20 years after the last post-judgment activity. For any case involving a sentence of 20 years or more, we have to retain that information permanently. So you're talking about restoring high definition video for very long periods of time, and that's a very expensive proposition as well. Two other concepts that I'll discuss quickly are implicit bias training. We are very much in favor of bringing implicit bias training to all law enforcement personnel, in particular prosecutors and police. And this is something that I don't know that needs to be legislated, but we recognize the need for it and made it one of our recommendations. We actually already started taking action on it. The Msaa reached out to federal authorities and Professor Russell McLean from the University of Maryland to develop a rollout of a statewide robust implicit bias training that is designed for law enforcement personnel. And the reality is I've attended implicit bias trainings before, generic ones, and they are good, they're informative. But I think if you're going to really reach the audience, you need to tailor the message to the audience. And so implicit bias training that is specifically tailored to law enforcement personnel is critical in us getting ahead of some of the problems that we face. And Msaa is starting to address those issues. The other point that I'll raise is diversity initiatives in hiring for both police and state attorney's offices. I think it's very clear that having people of different backgrounds and perspectives in a place when you're making decisions makes a huge difference and huge outcome, changes in outcome of the decision-making process for the positive, for the better. And so I think that you really need to ensure that we have diverse people making these decisions, because they're going to pick up on nuances and issues that if everyone's of one mindset, of one perspective, they will miss. So the Msaa is very much in favor of hiring initiatives that promote diversity in our workspace and in the police force. In closing, we are truly grateful for this opportunity to work with you. We recognize that change is needed, and we very much want to be at the table and help to shape that change and be part of that change while maintaining safety and security for the people we represent. Again, thank you, Delegate Atterbury, and thank you to all the commission members for the opportunity to speak before you. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you, State's Attorney Gibson. Next, State's Attorney Braithwaite from Prince George's County.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think I have some slides that you will have to let. Okay, great. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity, not just to represent Msaa, but also the Prince George's County State's Attorney's Office. My Principal Deputy, Jason Abbott, is on the line, as well as Renee Joy, who is the chief of my Public Integrity Unit. Depending on the questions that you all might have, I can tell you that Renee Joy is an expert in this area of police use of force and excessive force cases. She prosecutes most of those cases for our office. So she might be very useful to you as you all deliberate. Next slide. So the Msaa supports the creation of a legislative requirement that each state's attorney's office is notified of any allegation of police misconduct. Msaa supports rules requiring prosecutors be notified because we need to meet our Brady-Giglio obligations. There's also case law, Robinson v. State, that provides in the language of that decision that police are an arm of the prosecution, and thus discovery, disclosure requirements are applicable to the prosecution also apply to the police. And so we think it's really important for us to have access to information that IAD has in its possession so that we can review them to ensure that we're meeting our obligations to the defense. So I know, and I believe that our colleague, State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby, will be presenting a little later on the agenda. Her agency has a great partnership and MOU with the local city solicitor's office to provide greater access to internal affairs information. And we think that that model should be, or a similar model should be recreated throughout the state and really be uniform throughout the state. So we are in Prince George's County, we're trying to push both on the local level and certainly on the state level to greater access. Next slide. There are various laws that impact what law enforcement discloses, not just to the public, but even to the state's attorney's offices. So local personnel laws may impact what information is disclosed, LEOBRA, obviously, and MPIA. Next slide. MSAA also recommends a statewide database for police misconduct. I think it's somewhat self-explanatory, but we think it's extremely important and it could be a very valuable tool for departments throughout the state. A statewide database would track terminations, criminal convictions, and civil judgments against law enforcement officers in cases where excessive force is alleged. With the creation of a statewide database, Maryland police departments will have access to findings of misconduct among the candidates who are applying before they're employed, not after they're employed by another jurisdiction. So we really believe that a statewide database would be very useful. Next slide. The MSAA is also opposed to an independent agency usurping our constitutional obligations to prosecute cases, including those involving police use of force, because if there are legitimate conflicts, let's say in the case of a police shooting or a serious bodily injury type of case, we already have a process to refer those cases to other jurisdictions if we believe that there is a conflict. So, but local state's attorneys are elected by the residents of their jurisdictions. Each elected state's attorney has constitutional authority to investigate and prosecute cases within their respective jurisdictions. And state's attorneys in those local jurisdictions are familiar with the customs and culture of the community and law enforcement. And we would tailor our enforcement and sentences to comport with our local customs and norms. You know, essentially we are responsible for everyone in our community and everyone's actions. And so we don't believe that, you know, in any way, the local state's attorney is not equipped to handle these types of prosecutions. What I'll say is that, you know, very publicly, I recently announced a decision in a case involving the death of a civilian. Those are very tough cases, but I took my responsibility very seriously. Obviously, we presented the case to a grand jury, but we also hired an independent consultant to assist us in investigating and making recommendations with respect to the officer's actions in that case. Ultimately, it was determined that the actions of the officers were objectively reasonable, and we did not prosecute. Also, the grand jury declined to prosecute in those cases as well. However, or indict in those cases, excuse me. But what I will say is that being able to, for me personally, to be able to go to the community and let them know that we took every necessary action to conduct an independent and fair and transparent investigation. We, in fact, released the report of our independent consultant to the public. We showed a level, I think, of transparency that probably has not occurred in Maryland, but we will continue to do that because I think it's very important that local state's attorneys take on those responsibilities. But again, to take the power away from the local state's attorney to prosecute these cases, we believe would be a mistake, but ensuring that local state's attorneys have the ability to and resources to conduct independent investigations and be transparent with the public when we can. So like, for instance, if we are going to prosecute, obviously we're not going to provide a lot of information before trial. But if we decline to prosecute, I think it's really important that we explain to the public why we are not moving forward with the case. I think our public deserves that. So I think it really was very useful to the communities impacted by this terrible tragedy to have the local state's attorney, me, coming to the public, letting them know what the results were. So again, we think that's an important power and responsibility of local state's attorneys. And I just want to echo what Rich Gibson said about body-worn cameras. Our police department here locally is the Bureau of Patrol will all get body-worn cameras, I think by sometime early next year. And our concern obviously is processing, redacting, and handling that video. And so we are certainly proposing some additional staff for that. We're not sure if we're going to get it, but we believe it's important. So I would ask that as you will think about, just different, when you think about implementing new laws or new requirements, that you please keep us informed and get our position on things so that we can help you all think through how much the actual cost will be and what the impact will be once you make a decision. We do believe you're moving in the right direction. We understand reform must happen, will happen, and we just want to be a part of that reform in a meaningful way. So thank you very much, and we're here to answer any questions after my colleague, John McCarthy speaks. Thank you.
Thank you, State's Attorney Brave Boy. And next, the State's Attorney from Montgomery County, State's Attorney McCarthy.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. It's an honor to be back before you again. And I will tell you, I've listened to some of your other hearings where I was not a participant, and I clearly understand change is coming to Maryland. And I'm aware, I have not familiarized myself with all of the suggestions that are coming to the Senate next week. From one of the senators, from Will Smith from my county, but I will tell you, there is a huge breadth to the issues that are going to come before the legislature, and very, very important decisions that the members of this committee will have to make in the upcoming months. Look, I just want to say one thing. First of all, it's an honor to be here with Aisha and Rich. And Rich has been the chair of this committee, and I just want to just publicly acknowledge the wonderful job that Rich has done. I will tell you, when you bring, it's a little bit like herding cats when you're herding state's attorneys. Maybe that's like herding delegates too. I'm not quite sure. But in any instance, again, Rich told you we're 14 Republicans, 10 Democrats. But I'm here today to talk about a consensus of ideas, not necessarily everything that's personal to me, but a consensus of ideas that where we have absolute support from our membership about changes that we think need to take place. I'm going to talk a little bit about body cameras, and it's already been touched upon, but I would respectfully suggest Montgomery County, we have about 1,600 cameras in place on the street already. The Sheriff's Department and the Police Department alone have 1,200, but I've got 9 departments in Montgomery County. And so the challenge of arming all of those officers that are out there patrolling Gaithersburg City or Rockville or Chevy Chase or all the other different communities that I serve, it's an enormous challenge. Now, we also know that when we study these things, cameras reduce complaints against police on use of force issues. Every study that's ever been done tells us that. Every study also tells us people who are on camera act better towards the police. It is a way to reduce tensions and violence to have a camera on a police officer. Also, and Rich talked about this earlier, look, there's more work that's added to us than cut away from us by virtue of having cameras, but more cases actually resolve quicker when you actually have body-worn footage that you can go to. Look, the cost to purchase is not cheap. I will tell you the initial acquisition cost in Montgomery County was about $1.2 million. $1.2 million. Rich talked about this a few minutes ago. Our storage fees to store that. And once we download the footage and we store it and we put it up in some cloud, it's about $500,000 a year just in Montgomery County. Individual units, every camera that we purchased cost us $400. The wall charging mount for each is $40. The charging bay for those cameras, which does take 6 cameras, is over $1,500. This is real recurring money. And also, and I think both Aisha and Rich talked about this, there's no way to review body camera footage other than in real time. And it's really time consuming. The Justice Department says, and they estimate for every 100 cameras that you put on the street, a prosecutor's office will need 1 additional employee. Well, if you're talking about 1,600 more cameras for Montgomery County, that's 16 more bodies to do all the work that Aisha and Rich have so, eloquently already spoken about already. A second issue that came in our letter that we sent to you, Madam Chair, was about creating a legislative requirement that we be notified about all allegations of police misconduct. I will tell you, I think that we've probably done in the past a pretty decent job looking at issues that go to truth and veracity. In my office, we don't have an MOU, but we have a system. I don't know if it's exactly what Maryland does in Baltimore City, but we go over it every week and look at every new allegation of misconduct. But our focus has primarily been, and people would probably understand this, on truth and veracity, because if we have something that indicates that an officer is a liar, we have an obligation to supply that information to the other side. But we go over and we do that. I really do think that it's important that we expand it beyond truth and veracity and require that police, and we get to see these things, but to require that they tell us about allegations of police excessive use of force. Because I will tell you, sometimes, here's a real practical example. If we don't find out about these situations in a timely fashion, statute of limitations runs. Sometimes these investigations internally go for very long times in internal affairs in the police department. By the time we learn about the allegation, because the person who was the victim of, alleged victim of some excessive use of force, they may report to the police, but they didn't file a charge. There was nothing that waved a flag to Rich or Aisha or I that there was a matter there. And so unless internal affairs tells us, we don't know to look at that allegation of force situation. And let's assume it boils down to an assault, but the statute of limitations is 1 year. We lose our ability to go forward. We think that there also, there's also an absence of the federal government has failed to establish a legal requirement that there be a national database set up on police misconduct, use of force, et cetera. This is one of the recommendations of the Obama report on policing in the 21st century that came out in 2015, but the federal government has failed to do that. So to some extent, the challenge is to the legislature here in Annapolis to fill that gap. I join in my colleagues in agreeing that we need implicit bias both at the police and in the state attorney's offices. I will tell you the association itself has implicit bias training that's going to be made available to all of us through the association. I've taken implicit bias training like Aisha myself twice before, and we are also handling and holding in-house implicit bias training. The police department in my jurisdiction, it was not part of the routine training until about a year ago. They have just beginning to do implicit bias training. Independent agencies to look at police use of force cases, particularly those resulting in death. Again, independent evaluation of whether or not that use of force was appropriate or not. It was one of the fundamental recommendations of the Obama report in 2015 on policing in the 21st century. So the idea that we're now talking about this, look, this idea has been there. People who have studied this have been urging us to move in this direction for at least the last 5 or 6 years. I will tell you that in Montgomery County, we attempted since 2015 to find another police department that would partner with us to take on this responsibility. We've gone to the FBI, we went to the state police, we went to other counties that we went to Howard County, but we're a lot bigger than Howard County. We're about 4 times bigger in terms of population. Let me tell you, it's a daunting thing for the Howard County Police to say, we're going to exchange cases with Montgomery County. You can make those kinds of side deals in some cases, but people are afraid of counties my size. I think they'd be afraid of taking on the burden of a Prince George's County or a Baltimore City. These are large jurisdictions where finding someone to partner with is very difficult. That's why the legislature needs to act. Some states have done this. You need a centralized agency. I'm originally from New Jersey. I happen to know that the state police in the state of New Jersey, they have centralized in the state police, and they have funded the state police to expand their ability to handle these cases. Some jurisdictions, some really small jurisdictions in Montgomery County do go to the state police, and they will handle a police-involved shooting or death. But they don't want to take on a Prince George's County, a Baltimore City, or a Montgomery County because the jurisdictions are simply too large. Databases about misconduct, I guess I'll leave that. I think that's really important. Background checks for employees. I will tell you, I think that the level of background checks that are done to some extent vary depending upon the size of the police departments and agencies and how much resources they can put into it. In any instance, I think it's particularly important, specifically and most importantly, if a police officer is discharged from agency A and now applies to agency B, those background checks are absolutely vital to know the quality of the people that we are hiring. Now, and I will say to you, I adopt many of the comments that Rich made earlier about the work that is done of a very positive nature by police officers around the state. One of the challenges, we're talking about background checks, is a real challenge in law enforcement today. And that real challenge is applications for people who want to be the police are down about 70%. We talk a lot about the screening. I will tell you, obviously we are reimagining how policing is going to be done in the state of Maryland. But I will tell you right now, one of the crises we have is encouraging good people who want to see us police ourselves properly to want to be the police. And right now, you talk to the agencies that are trying to do hiring, they can't find anybody who wants these jobs. That's a real challenge for us and for our communities. I support the diversity initiatives that Rich talked about. Oh, look, I've always said this since I've been state's attorney in Montgomery County. We need to look like the community that we serve. I actually think that Montgomery County, I think population-wise, we're the largest. I think we're also the most diverse. I cite my school numbers only as an example. Montgomery County Public Schools, despite what anybody thinks, we're over 30% Hispanic. That's the largest segment of our school population is Hispanic. I think it's about 31 or 32%. The white population in our schools is about 28%. The African-American population is 21%. And our Asian American population is 14% of our community. We are a really diverse community. I think it is vital. Chief Robert Bell, who retired from the Court of Appeals, did a study on racial bias in the courts years ago. And one of the things that he found in that is that there was a perception, particularly in the minority communities in this state, of people that were Black and brown. Only about 1 out of 3 thought that if they found themselves in the criminal justice system, they were going to get a fair shake. I thought that was a stunning indictment when that finding was made. It's gone probably close to 10 years ago now. And I think that's always been a personal challenge to me to make sure that the men and women that work for me reflect the diversity of our community. I think it's one of the fundamental ways in which we build trust. Let me just, I'll close with one other thing because I don't want to exceed my time here, is obviously we do in fact support some changes to the LBOR. I'll make 2 comments. Number one, not all states have an LBOR statute. There's only 15 states in the country that have one. Some have statutes that permit local police agencies to negotiate through their labor contracts those kinds of protections of the police in their union contracts. So when you're talking about the statute itself is one level, I will tell you in Montgomery County, I think the issues that you are trying to get at, they go beyond the state statute. They're not limited to the state statute. They really go to union negotiated due process rights in individual counties that go beyond the power of the legislature, but it's something we need to focus on so that chiefs can get rid of bad cops. And in my jurisdiction, my chief cannot fire a bad cop. Under a labor agreement, it goes through a 3-person panel to accept or reject the recommendation of the chief. Thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing me to have some input in this conversation. I'm honored to be joined here with my colleagues.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for presenting today to the work group. There are a couple of members who have questions, but I'm going to start off with perhaps a comment, perhaps a question. So I am going to focus on the independent investigation and prosecution. And if what I'm hearing is right, you support independent investigations, but not independent prosecution, if that's what I'm hearing. And so I guess my concern is, one, I think what we're seeing nationwide and what we're also seeing here in Maryland is that the community does want independent prosecution and investigation because they want to feel like the police aren't investigating themselves, and because you work so closely with, and I know this isn't accusatory, we all know that the three of you are wonderful people, but I think the citizens feel like because your offices work so closely with the police that there are those relationships there. You all do know one another very well. So I think the citizens feel, and we need to ensure from a legislative perspective that there's transparency there, and that there's fairness, and that there's also uniformity, and that there's uniformity across the state of Maryland. I think that this is our moment in time as a legislature to make sure in some areas of policing that we can do that. And I don't know where the work group is going to go with that, but I feel this is one of those areas where we can do that. I know that Howard County, Montgomery County had an agreement. I don't know if that's working out or not working out. It was mentioned that all jurisdictions have a process in place if a conflict does arise. So if someone could touch on that, I would appreciate it, to explain what that process is. And then also it was mentioned that, you know, you all are elected to take care of your jurisdictions, and you are, but there are other agencies, perhaps the Attorney General's office, he's elected statewide, actually. So, you know, when it comes to just death and serious bodily injury, perhaps that's the appropriate place. I'm not saying it is, but perhaps it is, because he's elected as well. And he could certainly utilize the state police to help him in those investigations. Because I think the problem is, and State's Attorney Brave-Boy, you mentioned, I mean, you in fact hired an independent investigator. So I think the customs and norms and the practices that Black and brown people have been experiencing, that is the problem. And that's what we need to get away from in policing and in prosecution, to ensure uniformity in prosecutions. So if, this is a loaded question, but if you were not to handle prosecutions where there's been just a death or serious bodily injury, just if hypothetically you weren't handling that anymore, where would you like to see that rest?
Okay.
No,
which one?
First, or?
Sure. Do you want me to go first? Sure, I'll go first. I think it's down. Unless you want to go,
I'm happy to, because I know it was one of
areas that. Perfect. Ladies first.
Thank you. So look, I believe very strongly that the state's attorneys, the local state's attorneys, have the greatest responsibility to the people that elected them. Yes, the attorney general is elected, but that attorney general is elected statewide. So whether any specific jurisdiction supports or does not support that elected attorney general will likely not, impact the outcome of their election, any one jurisdiction, let's say. But with respect to the local prosecutor, we actually have a greater responsibility and more direct contact with our constituents, and they can hold us more directly accountable. So I do believe that people want individuals to be held accountable to them. You know, the fact that I was able to conduct an independent investigation, which we all can through our grand jury, but I wanted to also have the benefit of an independent use of force expert that could assist in evaluating the case. I think that is the responsibility that I personally felt I owed my community. And the resulting decision, we were very transparent about it. And I was very vocal about it. And we, again, released that report to the public. And I think that local prosecutors have the ability to do that. Certainly not everyone may have the resources to do it. But let me just say this, my prosecutors, and I think all of the local state's attorneys will tell you, we know our community. We present cases to them all the time, and we understand how to try cases in our specific jurisdictions. I would probably feel uncomfortable, just being honest, having someone else come in, unless there's a direct conflict, to try this level of case in my community. Because if or not, you know, maybe they make the decision not to try it. I think that the responsibility to inform the public and if there is a prosecution, feeling comfortable with how that prosecution is being conducted, I think the local prosecutors should be able to weigh in and have a say on that. That's my personal opinion. And I know that my public integrity unit chief is on the line as well, in case you have any questions about how we go about conducting those. But that unit is separate and apart from my other prosecuting unit. So the prosecutors that are in the public integrity unit don't try like the other general cases in our office. And I think that is considered best practices throughout the country. I believe Ms. Mosby, when she speaks, will speak to that as well. So there is a separation from the attorneys doing criminal work in our office and those that are doing the public integrity work in our office. We have had successful prosecutions. We take on tough cases. I trust the judgment of the attorneys in my office. I don't know about the judgment of the attorneys in the Attorney General's office. They're not used to trying this level of case. The best homicide prosecutors in our state reside in this local state's attorney's offices because they're the ones that are trying these cases. We have close to an 80+% closure rate of homicide cases in Prince George's County. So we are busy. Our homicide unit is busy. They're very experienced, and we have over a 90% success rate in terms of our convictions. And it's because we have experienced prosecutors who are trying these cases routinely. I don't know how I would feel about having another entity handling these cases that don't routinely handle homicide cases, because that's a specialty and they're tough cases. And so I just feel very strongly that if we're elected to be responsible for our communities, to seek justice at every level, whoever's involved in it, whether it's an officer involved case or a civilian involved case, it is our responsibility. And so I think we can do it in a way that is independent if we use our grand jury the ways we should, if we need to have outside experts, especially with complex cases, we have the ability to reach out to those experts. And again, be transparent with the community when you can't move forward. When you can move forward, obviously they will see a prosecution, but when you can't, you just have to be honest with the community. And I think that's the local state's attorney's responsibility.
If I may, I'd like to add a couple points to the points that State's Attorney Braveboy just made. So the first premise, or first question I guess you posed, Delegate Atterbury, related to our position being in favor of independent investigations, but not independent prosecutions. So I will just add that there's a clear delineation between those two things. If a prosecutor in Howard County was accused of committing a crime in Howard County, there is no question and no debate that case would immediately and automatically be paneled out to an outside agency. We would not investigate and prosecute our own. We would immediately panel it out. It is distinguishable from a prosecutor who is evaluating the conduct of police. Now, to be clear, as you also pointed out, I have an agreement with State Attorney John McCarthy that in cases involving police-involved death, we switch what jurisdiction actually investigates and prosecutes that case. That agreement is not theoretical. We've done 5 police-involved death investigations and prosecution evaluations for Mr. McCarthy, and Mr. Attorney McCarthy has done 2, or is in the process of doing 2 for us. So our agreement works great. However, that's not the premise. That's not the principle of that is not what the MSAA feels is best. Their argument, which I think it doesn't contradict, is that each state's attorney should have the ability to decide what the best course of action is for their cases. And we are directly responsible and directly elected by our constituents in our jurisdiction. And our judgments should reflect and must directly reflect the will of the people we represent. You mentioned having the AG do it, right? Well, the AG is elected, and you said he's elected statewide. Well, what that does is it does dilute the voice of each constituent. In Howard County, there are 300,000 people who say Rich Gibson is our state's attorney, and they, some portion, a majority of that portion vote me into office, and I'm there as long as they find me to be a good and obedient servant, serving their will. If they deem that I'm doing something improper, they have the ability to directly vote me out every 4 years. With the AG, there are 6 million people in the state of Maryland, so each voter's voice is diluted by the equivalent amount. So 6,300,000, 1/20th of the voice in speaking to whether that person is handling the case in a way that reflects their values and their views. My decision to continue with and codify in writing the MOU between Montgomery County and Howard County related to police-involved deaths is an exercise. I'm giving up some of my control, some of some of the powers vested in me by the community as it relates to those kind of cases to another jurisdiction, because I feel that is what my community wants. But other state's attorneys are saying my direct constituents don't want that or don't agree with that philosophy, and they are answerable directly to them. And so I think that's a key distinction. Another thing that State Attorney Braveboy touched on that I want to really highlight is specialization of skill set of the investigating agency. State police are a phenomenal agency. I think the world of them. However, as State Attorney Braveboy said, homicide cases, homicide investigations, and I was in homicide for a long period of time in Baltimore City, those detectives have specialized skills, specialized training, and are dealing with a specialized type of problem that have unique issues. And the state police don't generically handle homicide cases. What if the state police were to be the body housed, if the state police were to be the body that was charged with investigating police-involved deaths across the state, it would be best for them to have a separate unit carved out and staffed with people who have direct experience in the variety of jurisdictions. So they're familiar with all the local customs and ways of doing things and the local value systems of various jurisdictions that have homicide experience. So homicide investigators from across the state could be retained for that state police unit, but the state police themselves don't have a specialized expertise in dealing with these kind of cases. And I think it should be separately funded if they're going to do that. And again, it should be staffed with individuals that have that specialized, localized knowledge.
If the one question I had is that has not been answered yet is if you know, this was to be taken from the individual state's attorneys, it just involving death, police shootings, death, and serious bodily injury, where is the proper place do you think it should be housed?
So I believe our answer, based upon the meetings that we held, where we had all 24 electeds together, or we talked about our reform positions, is that it should not be. So I understand you're saying if it were to be. Our answer is that it should not be. Like your request, we feel would be detrimental to public safety.
Okay. Next, go ahead, State's Attorney McCarthy.
I just, one of the things you asked the delegate was whether I thought the arrangement with Howard County was working. Maybe it's because I've got a great partner in Rich. I think it works extraordinarily well, and we communicate all the time. One of the dangers of individual, this is not a direct answer to your question, but one of the dangers of the kind of arrangement Montgomery has with Howard is that because I'm so much larger, I could overwhelm the resources of a smaller office. We relatively, the first 4 or 5 years we did it, we were pretty even in terms of cases we exchanged with the prior state's attorney. Recently, it's been kind of lopsided. He's gotten more than twice as many as I've gotten, and I've offered to help out in other ways. But I will tell you, leaving it to individual jurisdictions to make these kinds of arrangements could lead to workload inequities that put burdens on smaller counties like Rich's, which is we talk about it all the time. And I'm very aware of it, but the arrangement we have works well because of the collaboration between the two jurisdictions. A centralized body to look at it would maybe avoid those discrepancies in the exchange rates between a larger and a smaller jurisdiction. Beyond that, I yield to the position of the association.
Thank you. I do want to let everybody who's participating and everyone who's listening in, I failed to mention that the Speaker of the House is listening. She is not logged on like she normally is because we have various Zoom meetings and hearings going on, and she's trying to stay on top of everything. And Chair Clippinger of the Judiciary Committee is on with us. So next, Delegate Fisher has a question, and then Delegate Moon.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam State's Attorney and Mr. State's Attorneys for presenting. So I have two questions, and one's a clarifying for the public, because I think as a member of Judiciary, I'm very familiar with the States Association, but this is a public hearing. I don't know if they are. You all talked about the makeup of the States Attorney Association, but I think it's important to clarify that each county has one vote. So a rural county that might have 3 state's attorneys for the entire county has the same vote as my state's attorney, who is running over 100 attorneys. And I think that that directly leads into the policy that you're also presenting. And with that being said, you know, I appreciate all the commentary and State's Attorney McCarthy and others about the swapping of jurisdictions and all of that. But the reality is that we don't have consistency around the state. And I think the most flawed part of the argument that I'm hearing is that the electorate will keep you accountable. But if the electorate doesn't have the same view as justice as we do, then there is no accountability. If we look at Anton Black and the actions that were taken in that jurisdiction, well, then you don't see that accountability. So my question to you all is, your theory that the localities electorate will keep the state's attorney accountable. How does that account for maybe our more conservative jurisdictions that the 3 of you aren't representing? That's my first question. And then my second question, beyond that accountability of the jurisdiction itself is, I know you said for a state's attorney, I'm sorry, Madam Chair's question about having an outside prosecutor for those is not the right public policy question, then can you all explain to us why, I think it was since 2006, there have only been 5 officers in Maryland that have actually been prosecuted and convicted? Does that then mean the statute needs to change, that we need to change the criminal statute that prosecutors are getting conviction? Or is it really the process? Because to me, it sounds like you're saying the process is fine for internal, the process is fine for you all to prosecute your own departments. So then what is wrong in the process that we're not getting convictions at the end? Why it's only 5 in the last like 10 years?
So the question, is that for police involved shootings or serious bodily injury?
Police, yeah, police involved shootings.
I've had 2 convictions just like since I've been state's attorney.
Okay, well, this is all the data since 2019. So I will say that, and that was presented to us, I think, like 2 hearings ago. But either way, the public is very dissatisfied. Whatever you're looking at, 10, 5, 15, 50, the public is dissatisfied with actual prosecutions happening. So if the process and the locality prosecuting it themselves, you're saying, is correct, then is it the statute itself that is flawed? And then my first question was, well, then what do you do for jurisdictions where the electorate, you're saying, keeping the state's attorney accountable, does not have the same view of justice as this committee does?
So, Delegate Fisher, you pose really complex questions, questions that kind of it goes to the heart of like, what is the role of government? And so several things. First off, your first observation is correct. We are like the Senate. It's there are 24 jurisdictions and each jurisdiction has 1 vote. So you're absolutely correct as far as the way the body works. Your second question, as it relates to how different areas view justice, is tricky. And the reason why it's complex is because there's a role of government that says, we are elected and we know best, so we're going to tell you what we think it should reflect. And then the people then either accept or reject that view, right? There's another role of government that says, a way of viewing government that says, I am beholden to the people who put me here. I'm a public servant and I have to reflect my best judgment, but also combine that with what I think the people that put me here want to see. So there's kind of 2 distinct paths, if you want to look at it that way, for what good leadership looks like, what good governance looks like. The third issue relating to the number of convictions, I think, is also complex, because the goal is not to convict people. The goal is to hold people accountable if they've violated the law, whether they're police or not. The goal is to have one sense of justice, one sense of right and wrong, one sense of equity and fairness, and not bend that because the person happens to have a badge and a gun. There's a right course of action and a wrong course of action. When you do wrong, we want people to hold you accountable. When you do right, then you should not bear the weight of your action if your action was correct, even because you have a badge and a gun. But rather, if you have a badge and a gun and you do wrong, we're going to make sure that you experience the same fair, even justice that everyone else would be held to. I think those are my nuanced observations. It's not a direct answer to your question, but those are my nuanced observations about the question, which make it very difficult to answer.
And I would like to answer that also, because if you look nationally at some of the most high profile cases where, let's say, the Department of Justice have come in to investigate those cases, where the community was in unrest over the decision, let's say, of the local prosecutor in certain cases, and we all know of them where a prosecution was not made in certain cases. Even when the Department of Justice came in with all of their resources, their experience and everything else, they also did not indict those cases. So Sometimes it is the outcome, not necessarily investigation, that's the issue, but the ultimate issue, as I'm reminded by my Public Integrity Unit Chief, Renee Joy, is the Supreme Court. There is a case when it comes to excessive force and use of force cases. Graham versus Connor is the prevailing law of the land when it comes to evaluating these cases. And that case sets out what's called an objective reasonableness standard for officers. If it is objectively reasonable for an officer to use force under the circumstances in that case, then it is deemed justified. The force is deemed justified. And so that objective reasonableness standard really just speaks to at the time the force was used. That's another issue, but that is the prevailing law. So anytime that we are evaluating a case, we have to be able to prove our case before we can indict it. Same thing goes for the federal government. We have to believe we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. That objective reasonableness standard is very, very narrow. So unless we can get across that hurdle of saying that the officer's actions were unreasonable under the circumstances, from that perspective, then there will not be an indictment and prosecution in those use of force cases. So let's say there's an argument between an officer and a civilian and it escalates. If at the time that the force is used, not what happened before, what happened immediately after, if at the time that the force was used, it is reasonable, not what's in that person's mind actually, it is what is objectively reasonable looking at it. So if the person is pointing a gun at that officer or has a weapon and is, and it is reasonable for that officer to assume that if that person uses that weapon, that the officer would end up dead or have serious bodily injury as a result of it, then they would meet that threshold and there would likely not be a prosecution in that case. If the officer's action is objectively unreasonable, so let's say that the person had, I don't know, a pen or a pencil. Now they could be dangerous too, so I don't want to get into too many facts, but my point is if they have an instrument in their hand that objectively, if you look at it, would not cause serious bodily harm or death to that officer, then if the officer uses deadly force, then that would not be reasonable. That would be unreasonable, and then a prosecution would occur. It doesn't matter what the thought in the officer's head is. It doesn't matter the officer's intent. It matters only what is objectively, when looking at the totality of the circumstances, is reasonable at the time the force is used. That, I think, is the issue in most of these use of force cases. Is why a lot of them are not prosecuted. And that's why there's a lot of unrest and people are not satisfied. But it doesn't matter who delivers the message, whether it's me delivering the message or the attorney general delivering the message or the U.S. attorney delivering the message. If there's not going to be a prosecution, people are not going to be happy with the results, because in our minds, in the lay people's minds, their thinking is, was it necessary? That's not the standard. That's not the question. The question is not, unfortunately, the question is not, was it necessary? It is, was it objectively reasonable for, objectively reasonable for the officer to use force at the time the force was used? That is why you don't see prosecutions in many of these cases, because the prosecutor, whether it's a local or federal prosecutor, can't get across that threshold.
And I appreciate you, Madam State's Attorney, unpacking that. And that's exactly what I was trying to get to about our committee looking at. Yes, it's Supreme Court law, but what can we do to abut that, to make that threshold as clear and as easier here?
You froze up, Delegate Fisher. You
For the
froze.
state of Maryland, because we all know officers are saying I was fearing for my life, right? And so I think that for those of us in judiciary, we know that that's the standard, but we can challenge ourselves to push up against that as much as we can here in Maryland. And I guess my question to the state's attorneys is that the problem then? Because you're saying it's not the problem that you're doing the local investigation and prosecution. So you tell us, what is the problem?
So I think next we're going to move on to Delegate Moon has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. And let me just pause quickly and say, I think it's important for internet viewers to know that the prosecutors here are from Howard, Montgomery, and Prince George's, and these are partisan races. And these three prosecutors all happen to be from the same party. So in terms of evaluating the reasonableness of their views, I would just point out that prosecutors in the counties have great discretion over what gets charged in their county. And a lot of the other prosecutors that are not from those 3 counties have very different views about what's appropriate to charge and not to charge, just so everyone's aware. And I think these 3 are representing in some ways, the positions of the state's attorneys from the state. So just want to clarify all of that. So anyway, I was struck by some of the opening positions by the State's Attorneys Association. So I just asked for a little bit of clarification, particularly on some of the opening comments about police funding. So I just wanted to clarify the organization's position on this. I get where you started your comments, but isn't it an entirely appropriate conversation for the community to be asking whether armed police are the correct people to dispatch for calls for service for our mental health, homelessness, housing code, noise, traffic, etc., and that this is inherently tied up with what everybody knows is budget cuts coming, and so we're all going to be left with tough choices about where things to go. So I want to clarify if the State's Attorneys Association is opposed, has a rigid position that as that conversation unfolds, no, we just can't change the police budget for whatever reason. So that's question 1. And then question 2 that relates to is, if you're opposed to changing the police budget, you're acknowledging that it's difficult to charge these as crimes. You're also opposed to officers being sued in these cases. It sure seems to me it's leaving us with very little room. And so I would say if that's where we're at, don't you prosecutors and we lawmakers, together with the police, have a collective responsibility to go where we can and reduce unnecessary police violence. And I say that because we make the laws that we ask prosecutors to charge and police to go out in the street and enforce. And I disagree with the creation of many of these new crimes, but a lot of these traffic stops and whatever, they don't become real in someone's life until a prosecutor decides to bring them into court or use them to charge often a nonviolent crime. And you know them. We've been dealing with prosecutors bringing in truancy, sexting charges, attempted suicide, suspended driver's license, all manner of nonviolent stuff that's at the heart of these police debates now, and whether it's appropriate to have police enforcing loose cigarette laws, and SROs, police officers in schools, charging crimes out of sexting and things like that. So this larger question, can you really be against this funding question, also against the criminal charges, also against the law enforcement officers being sued, and then not be left with a position where, all right, well then damn it, we're just gonna have to stop charging and doing all this enforcement of the nonviolent stuff. What other solution is there?
Can I just say one quick thing, because I don't know, like, so as you know, the Maryland State's Attorneys Association will vote. Not everyone necessarily will agree, but the majority takes a position. And I believe that, you know, Rich leads that work group and is here to talk about the position of the Maryland State's Attorneys Association. So what I will say is that I do agree that we have to look at how resources are being spent to ensure that the appropriate response is working. And I think that's actually good for the police too, because oftentimes police don't want to be the only ones responding to incidents where there are people with mental health issues. And I can tell you that some of the recommendations that came out of the report, that our independent use of force expert report, kind of revealed some of the things that were lacking in Prince George's County around having a robust mobile crisis response team. And I think that you're right in that there may be other types of responses that don't require a sworn officer or as many sworn officers to show up on the scene, where you can divert those resources to assist and aid in the work that the police departments are called to do. Because oftentimes what they'll tell you is that they get a whole lot of calls that don't require a police response, but they are called, and so they go ahead and respond. But if we were able to reimagine what resources might be available for a community response, which may include law enforcement responding, but could possibly include other types of responses. I think that is best. I think it's the safer way for us to go about it. And so I would just like to say to Delegate Moon that, you know, I'm not exactly, and I know Rich or John,
I definitely want to comment, but
I'll comment completely. But I personally believe that we need to reimagine how the resources are used so that we can have the best outcomes, because sometimes when police engage, it doesn't produce the best outcome because they are not the appropriate people to respond depending on the type of incident they're responding to. So I hope that helps, and I'm sure that they'll also respond.
If I could, may I say, Delegate Moon, from being from Montgomery County, I'd like to, when Rich began his opening remarks, let me say to you, we did not come here today as a group to indicate that we were opposed to re-examining what's going on in terms of how we police in our counties. I'm on the reimagining task force in Montgomery County. I think each one of us is engaged in looking at that critically. Our association, I mean, just to clarify, the State's Attorneys Associations and the other prosecutors that we represent, we are not taking a position as an association against reimagining and analyzing how we spend taxpayer money. I thought Rich's comment, I'll defend him. I think Rich's comment was really just about the terminology, the word defunding, more than the idea that we are reimagining and looking at how we're going to deploy our resources, I think is absolutely essential. Delegate, you gave a whole list of things that you think that the police do right now, some of which, quite candidly, as you tick through your list, I'm thinking to myself, we don't need the cops to do that. We don't need the police to do that. Somebody short of a police officer could do that. I will tell you, I think where you need the input of state's attorneys and people that have been looking at these issues for a long time is the huge issue of dealing with the mentally ill and their intersection with the police. About 1 out of 3 people incarcerated in the United States probably belong in a hospital, not in jail. The Obama study in 2015 said 1 out of 2 police contacts in the United States, the person on the other side of the contact has a mental health issue in play. Do we need extended and more experienced training going to anybody who is a police officer in the area of mental health? Yes, yes, yes. Should we not be looking at and reimagining policing or how we respond to community issues like the mentally ill with things like co-responder teams? There are jurisdictions that are now developing protocols for co-responder teams where if you have an issue and you've identified where you are going, the person has a mental health issue in play, you respond maybe with a police officer, maybe, because the mental health specialist wants to be safe when they get there. Mm-hmm. And the place needs to be made safe. And we want to send a mental health specialist, not a police officer. As soon as the situation is safe, the officer retreats and the mental health. I think we should be talking about reimagining how we respond to many of these issues. And I don't know that mental health, and because we as communities have not appropriately dealt with the issue of mental health, this information has fallen to the feet of the police to deal with as a last, because we have not done enough for the mentally ill in our communities. So the police are the backstop for us. Should we be responding differently to homelessness and mentally ill? The answer to both of those questions is absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. And I will tell you, I'm not here either on behalf of Montgomery County or on behalf of the association arguing that we should not be looking at these things. These are fabulous questions. We need to reimagine. And I'll also tell you, if you talk to people who are police officers, if you said to them, guess what? We are never going to make you respond to another incident with a mentally ill individual. We're going to send somebody else. They would kiss you on the mouth, say, thank you very much. I don't want to go there. These are highly volatile situations that better trained people should probably be handling. But sometimes they need to be made safe when they get there. But I think we're all in favor of reimagining. I know I am.
So
I just
we're
want to
gonna-
be,
we're gonna-
I just want to be very, 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 very briefly.
Brief.
I'm sorry, Delegate Atterbury, I apologize. I just want to be very clear. So Delegate Moon, in my opening statement, I actually said, if you want to have a discussion about the reprioritization of funds, that is a conversation that we are willing to have. So we do not, as the MSAA, take any position that says that we cannot reimagine how we're going to spend the funds. There is an argument that says zero out the funds. And that, I think, would be disastrous. I want to make sure that point was driven home very clearly. And since we're short on time, I won't go any further. I'll defer to Delegate Atterbury.
Thank you, State's Attorney Gibson. We have 2 more questions, and I would just ask that one of you respond to each of the questions and kind of make it succinct. Delegate McComas and then Delegate Rosenberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. This is a question that I have. Procedurally, it's my understanding that the work group of the State's Attorneys Association made these recommendations, and how many folks, a small work group, and then it went to the whole group. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Who was on the work group?
The work group was comprised of myself, State's Attorney Brave Boy, State's Attorney Mosby. The list is long, actually. The work group was probably, out of the 24 of us, it might have been 17. And then the broad, we raised it at the next meeting. We had everybody present. At least I believe everyone was present. And we voted on it at that juncture.
Okay, because there's been some blowback that we've heard in Harford County that the Maryland chiefs of police were kind of surprised that one of your recommendations was that you think that the police, when there's a problem, needs to be investigated by an independent agency, but you don't want an independent police. You don't want an independent agency using their efforts. You usurping your constitutional obligations for prosecuting any case. In other words, you want the discretion to decide we prosecute or we don't. So I guess what I was going to say is you don't think that, kind of what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You don't feel there's a problem with that?
No, ma'am. I think I kind of alluded to it earlier. Our position is that there is a distinction that can be drawn between police investigating their own and the prosecution from that local jurisdiction investigating the police action, right? Prosecutors routinely, it's part of our mandate, part of our job in every case that comes forward that's police initiated, is to evaluate the quality of those officers and those officers' testimony, statements, things of that nature. So we are, in every case, at all times, we are evaluating the police conduct. And if we think it's appropriate, there are different ways that we handle that. There are times we refer it to a supervisor and say administratively, what they did was wrong and it needs to be addressed. There are times where we just dismiss the case and have a conversation with the officer. There's times where we charge the officer for some kind of violation that if it's egregious and leads to a criminal act, right? But we have the ability to do that in all cases. With the police investigating their own, again, it would be akin to a prosecutor in one of our offices committing a crime and then us not paneling that case out. Which, as I said before, if a prosecutor in Howard County got a DUI or shoplifting case or shoplifting charge, right? There's zero chance that my office would be prosecuting that case. That case would immediately be paneled out. I'd either call Steve Kroll or I'd call a neighboring, we have a good relationships with each other. I'd call a neighboring prosecutor, a state's attorney, and say, do me a favor. I have a case. There's a conflict in my office because the person works for me. Would you please take the case? That happens all the time with regularity. And so there is that distinction that I think exists between us prosecuting our own and the police policing their own.
Well, a lot of the sheriffs are constitutionally elected officers. And so they feel that they're equal to the constitutional obligations and power that the state's attorneys have. So basically, I think there's kind of like, they don't understand why they can't, because the sheriff can fire whoever you're kind of taking away their ability to manage their own department.
That's just it. They can't fire whoever. That's one of the points that State's Attorney McCarthy made in his presentation. The fact of the matter is their ability to fire their own officers is in some instances very limited, right? State's Attorney McCarthy described a situation where his chief wanted to fire an officer, but couldn't. It has to go to another body, and then they vote on it. He doesn't have direct control, right? In our instance, but again, this is not about constitutional power. It's about conflicts of interest, right? And where those conflicts of interest lie. So it's not about constitutional authority, but rather about, does there exist a patent or obvious conflict between the entity charged with investigating the act and the entity charged with prosecuting the act? Or is there a difference between those two positions? And the MSAA's position is that there is a difference between those two positions.
Thank you. Now,
Madam Chair, I just have one other quick question. And basically, one way that I assume that the drug task force, where they've had folks from different communities work on drug problems, that's been pretty successful when you have other jurisdictions that are a statewide drug task force that comes in and they prosecute or they investigate. Has that worked?
HIDA? Yeah. If you're talking about, HIDA has been effective. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
So maybe some type of model like that for doing investigation might work for use of force cases. So that kind of model.
Sure. I think we should. It's something that we should explore and flesh out more fully. But that's certainly one possibility. I would agree. Yes.
Okay. Madam Chair, this was the other question I was going to ask. When there is an investigation, has there been any research whether race, gender, sex make a difference in the community's comfort with the investigation and prosecution? In other words, let's say it's a white officer is accused of unlawful use of force against a Black person, or does that make a difference that whoever investigates, whether they're white or Black, or in other words, I would assume there would be more comfort if there was a Black person investigating, or a Black, several Black people investigating, as opposed to if it was a white person investigating the incident. I mean, do we have issues with race, gender, sex as to who handles the investigation and whether it is accepted by the community?
Does anyone want to answer that question? While you think about it, I'll also just say, I mean, nationally, this whole thing is about race. We're in this place because of race. We're in this place because brown and Black individuals have been mistreated by the police for decades and decades and decades. And for whatever reason, we are at this tipping point because we have seen George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of these other individuals. So I just think the succinct answer to your question, Delegate McComas, is absolutely race plays a part into this. I don't know if any of the state's attorneys want to chime in quickly before I move into the next. We have two more questions for you all, and then we've got to keep it moving. So Delegate Rosenberg, and then Delegate Acevero, and then State's Attorney Mosby is up.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm sorry, State's Attorney Brave Boy wanted to respond, but she is muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And I don't know. I mean, I think you, Chairwoman, were very succinct. I just didn't want to be left out of any of the upcoming questions because.
Okay. Thank you. Delegate Rosenberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. State's Attorney Gibson, since you touched on the issue of qualified immunity or limited immunity, if we only have, the argument's been made in another context, it was rent court, that I'm aware of, that if you only have criminal sanctions, then that is too heavy a sanction. Therefore, you also need to have civil sanctions available. How do you respond to that?
No, it has to do with the appropriateness of the conduct, right? If the officer's actions rise to criminal levels, then they should be fully accountable for their actions, right? There has to be one justice, right? Not a justice for police, a justice for community, one justice. No matter who you are, same rules apply to all of us, right? I think that in the case of, with qualified immunity, my fear is that if officers they have to react so quickly to situations that evolve very rapidly. And my fear is that if they're fearful of some fiscal consequence, they freeze. And in that moment of freezing, or they don't act, they let the guy with the gun walk by because they don't want to be involved with tussling with him and taking him down. And as a result, a day later, someone gets shot, and someone dies. We want officers to lawfully and properly enforce the laws. If a bad guy or girl has a gun that they shouldn't have, and an officer sees that, we don't want them to freeze, allow that, not move, not act. Perpetrator goes on and then hurts someone or kills someone or, harms someone in some way that could have been prevented had they acted. And so qualified immunity creates a chilling effect. It also, Attorney McCarthy mentioned this, it also impacts recruitment. So if people realize that going to this field, I could expose myself personally to fiscal loss for a judgment I make in the line of duty, that's going to be less people who want to go into that field, less good people that might want to go into that field. And that's troubling. We want good people who want to change the system for the better and who want to make a community safe to engage in law enforcement, to become police, right? To become legislators, to become prosecutors. And if we face fiscal accountability on a personal level for the choices we make in the scope of our duties, that is going to create a very chilling effect on whether we proceed.
And so you're saying that for the grievous example that is criminal, that's where we need to take action.
Yes, if an officer engages in conduct that does not comport with the law, then that officer should be held accountable for that action, right? If the officer's actions are confined within the law, then sometimes tragedies occur, but there's no criminal remedy, there's no criminal consequence. It depends upon whether that officer's actions were confined within the law. But we don't want officers to be afraid to act. We want officers to act justly, to be trained well, and behave in ways that reduce harm to people. And I think that's what this is. That's the position of the MSAA is in relation to this issue.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
The last question is from Delegate Acevero.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the presenters. I was just listening intently to each of you, and I want to circle back to Delegate Fisher's point. And the reason I think it's important is because if we look at cases like Anton Black, the 19-year-old that was killed in police custody on the Eastern Shore, where the Caroline County State's Attorney declined to bring charges against all of the officers involved in his death. I guess what I'm curious to know is what kind of, because it seems to me the fact that we don't have a statewide use of force standards with criminal implications for those officers that use excessive or deadly force when it isn't justified, plays a role in how things play out in the judicial system. And I guess I'm really curious to get your thoughts on what it is that we can do, because what I'm hearing is that if the law and the law has, there's in essence something within the law for you all to bring a charge, then you would. But if there isn't, then it's hard to bring those charges. So I guess what kind of a policy should we be pursuing where it would make your job, that of an elected prosecutor, easier in that if an officer were to use excessive or deadly force when when it's not necessary or justified, that you all would then be able to bring charges, and that victim and their families would be able to have a day in court. I think that's where we're trying to get at. We understand precedent, we understand Supreme Court ruling, we understand what the current standard is. What kind of a standard are we willing to create that establishes when it is appropriate and justified to use force, but also there is accountability built in for the individuals who use excessive or deadly force when it isn't justified, but also provides you all with the bandwidth to do your job as elected prosecutors. And let me just say that we're looking at a prosecution rate of law enforcement officers nationally that hovers, I believe, around 1%. And so the issue that people have is not just that police and law enforcement are investigating themselves, but the relationship between states' attorneys and law enforcement agencies provide such that in a number of cases, charges aren't being brought when it should be brought or aren't being brought in a timely manner. I want to be respectful of the investigative process, but what can we do to help you so that you can do your job as elected prosecutors to bring charges and serious charges at that for officers that use excessive or deadly force and breach public trust?
Delegate Acevero, I appreciate that question. I mean, as you know, in my office, right now we have an officer indicted for second-degree murder, and we have other officers indicted for very serious offenses. We've prosecuted 2, we've convicted 2 so far, and then we have others. So I don't believe that, at least from my office's standpoint, that we, in any way allow the relationship we must have when we investigate cases to interfere with the responsibility that we also have to investigate police use of force in and misconduct cases and bring charges where appropriate. And I have to use that term where appropriate, because regardless of whether it's my agency or another agency, unless we can prove, or that agency can prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt, there won't be an indictment, right? So the Supreme Court standard, at least when we're talking about use of force cases, is that objective, reasonable standard. And it is a very narrow standard. So, and then something that goes into that is the training and customs of the agency. And one of the things that the report that my use of force expert had in recommendations he had in his report was creating some uniformity around police training and doing joint trainings, because in Prince George's County, we have like over nearly 30 police agencies at any given time operating in our county, which includes all of our municipal police forces, park police, metro police. We just have a lot of agencies operating here, and sometimes they respond together. But anyway, long story short, my point in saying that is that I don't believe there is always uniformity amongst training for all of the police departments throughout the state of Maryland. So developing, more uniform or universal standards, doing more trainings, joint trainings, not just with the officers, but the state's attorneys as well, so that we are familiar with, what is acceptable, we believe is acceptable in our state. I think that it would be very, very helpful. So I absolutely think you're onto something there. I think that we do need to look at, and it certainly, I'm not the expert on this, but I think we certainly need to pull our law enforcement partners in, along with other use of force experts from either locally or nationally, to kind of talk about what those training standards and practices should be. So there is greater uniformity around, how police behave when they're interfacing with residents, not just here in Prince George's County or in Howard or in Montgomery, but anywhere in the state. Because while we prosecute within our own jurisdictions, people, our residents, including us, travel throughout the state. And there should be some expectation on how they will be treated. So I do agree that one of the things we can do a better job of is look at creating some type of uniformity around training.
With that, I will say thank you very much to State's Attorney Gibson, State's Attorney Braveboy, and State's Attorney McCarthy for joining us. We held you for a while, so we appreciate that. And now we will move on, and State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby from Baltimore City is joining us. Welcome, State's Attorney Mosby.
Thank you. And I would say good evening at this point. Well, it's still afternoon. Good afternoon, Chairwoman Atterbury, members of the work group to address police reform and accountability in Maryland. Like any American, I think that we are all utterly sickened by the murders of yet another Black person being killed by the police, captured on camera, which keeps happening time and time again. It seems that no matter who and what we do makes a difference in the eyes of those that won't see our humanity as Black people in this country. And so I'm encouraged that according to the AP polls, right, the veil of ignorance has been lifted from Americans in this country regarding race relations and police brutality against Black people in this country, and that our perceptions have shifted and changed since 5 years ago, so that we can now boast in the name of change that Black Lives Matter, which is no longer controversial or a controversial term as it was 5 years ago when I attempted to hold police accountable for the death of an innocent 25-year-old Black man by the name of Freddie Carlos Gray Jr. from West Baltimore, who was killed in the custody of Baltimore City Police. I'm encouraged that iPhones and body-worn cameras have done what televisions did in the 60s by sparking a movement for change when dogs and fire hoses were imposed upon Black children protesting for equal voting rights in the civil rights movement during the 60s. But now that the blinders have been removed from Americans, and even particularly from conservative associations in the state, denial is no longer a choice, and we recognize that we will be a better country only when we move from protest to policy, which is why we are all here, right? I support all of the recommendations of the Maryland State Attorneys Association, all of which my office has been advocating for the past 5 years. But as the state's attorney for Baltimore City, I'm presenting on behalf of my office as a state's attorney and also pushing the envelope even further. So I want to acknowledge and I want to thank Rich. I want to thank John. I want to thank Aisha. I truly, truly, truly appreciate your leadership on these issues. So first and foremost, I can say that we cannot, and as we've already discussed and has been brought up, we cannot underestimate the power of the local prosecutor. Elected by the people of that community, not appointed. State prosecutor is appointed by the governor, right? You cannot underestimate the power of the local prosecutor to apply one standard of justice to all, regardless of race, sex, religion, and even occupation. And that's what we've attempted to do in the city of Baltimore. And which is why we're here today. And you have to be courageous to apply that one standard of justice. Don't get me wrong. And I'm speaking from experience, right? You have to have courage to do your job and to prosecute police the same way that you prosecute every ordinary citizen in the city or the jurisdiction that you represent. The same way that you prosecute that trash worker or the Department of Public Works and the city employee or the fire department, you have to have courage. And let me tell you why. When we look at what happened in Minneapolis, there was an exacerbation And let me just emphasize the importance of the local prosecutor, because that has come up a couple of times. When we look at what happened in Minneapolis, there was an exacerbation of distrust when the local prosecutor failed to charge and made an excuse as to why he was not going to charge. And in fact, use me as an example. In Atlanta, the district attorney was able to quell the fears and distrust of a community when Paul Howard showed steady and decisive leadership following the death of Rayshard Brooks. In the city of Baltimore, accountability, which wasn't being had across this country in 2015, when an innocent 25-year-old Black man made eye contact with police, who was unconstitutionally arrested, placed into a metal wagon, head first, feet shackled, handcuffed, and whose spine was partially severed in the back of that wagon, and whose pleas for medical attention were subsequently ignored. That accountability, which wasn't being had across this country, that accountability led to exposure. A week after I charged those officers, the Department of Justice came into the city of Baltimore, exposed a pattern and practice of discriminatory enforcement. That exposure ultimately led to reform. We now have a federally enforceable consent decree that, despite the Trump administration, is still on record. And so when we think about those systemic reforms, we can highlight the importance of those local prosecutorial decisions. Right? That exposure led to accountability led to exposure led to reform. We now in the city of Baltimore have full implementation of body-worn cameras. We have the use of force policies that emphasize the sanctity of life and emphasize the de-escalation policies. When it comes to, and this was brought up by one of the delegates, we need a statewide use of force policy. There's an affirmative duty to intervene when fellow officers cross the line. The mandates to call a medic when requested. The fact that every single one of those police vans are now equipped with cameras, so we no longer have to rely on circumstantial evidence to prove our cases. And so when you talk about the power of the local prosecutor utilizing that discretion and the need for it, I think that we can look right to Baltimore City and see how it has impacted the state. And so while the majority of my testimony will be focused on good ideas on how to change the culture and systems of policing in the country, I also need to highlight for each and every one of you one bad idea. I'm just going to be candid. One bad idea that you as legislators should avoid and that I adamantly oppose. The people of Baltimore City didn't elect Brian Frost to be the state's attorney of Baltimore City. They elected Marilyn Mosby twice, right? And recently, at the state and federal level, there have been suggestions that passing a law to enable independent prosecutors, such as state prosecutor, to take over police misconduct, that this is the solution. And what I'm here to say is that that's not the solution. An appointed position that is appointed by a political position and a political person will transcend to political decisions. If the community has elected me to do a job and I don't do my job, guess what happens? They vote me out. Just like they did in St. Louis, just like they did in Chicago, just like they're doing all across the country. Now you allow the state prosecutor who is appointed by the governor to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to charge in a highly contested, sort of volatile situation, it becomes political. So I would just note that the community that I represent is not dissatisfied with my decisions. The state prosecutor is appointed by the governor, relying on politically appointed positions to carry out that one standard of justice is when it becomes political. In Baltimore City, we have secured 22 convictions against police officers during my tenure since Freddie Gray. My police integrity unit, made up of prosecutors who are walled off from other prosecutors in the office. We go above and beyond in transparency. My office being the only office in the state to provide detailed reports when we decide and we elect not to prosecute police officers accused of excessive and inappropriate force. We publish this information online so that the public and the media can understand exactly what our rationale, legal basis for us not proceeding against that charge. I can tell you that based upon the questions that have been posed, my office is the best equipped to handle police misconduct that occurs in our community. And proposals to take these cases away would undermine the will of the people who have elected me. The difficulty, but necessary truth is that we must hit reset on our criminal justice system entirely, right? It is in dire need of an overhaul, and all of those points have been brought up today. The public is ready for this change, and each and every one of you as lawmakers should seize this moment, which is why I appreciate being here to provide my perspective and opinion on how to do so. So I'll get into that. Number one, police should not be policing itself. We talked about that. Rich has brought that up so eloquently. In the gray cases, my office learned the hard way. I mean, I'm sorry, we had to be trial and error. One of the first to do it. We learned the hard way that as search and seizure warrants weren't executed, the most pertinent questions weren't asked, and notes and detectives were assigned to intentionally derail our case. That a police department that investigates their own officers and presents their findings to the prosecuting officer, it presents a natural conflict of interest. And I just have to be candid with you all. A prosecution is only as good as the investigation on which it is built. When the police are investigating their own, they control the effort, the timing of the investigation. What we've run up against in the past 5 years, a delayed investigation can result in the statute of limitations running out before the investigation is even concluded. If a case remains in the hands of the police, many departments combine their administration and their criminal investigation. That's problematic because what it ultimately creates is a conflict of interest, especially if the police officer is being compelled to give a statement, right? Under the administrative side of the investigation, the detective who usually handles both the criminal and the administrative side of the investigation is now tainted by the statement, as is the prosecutor. And that's what we ran up against numerous times. This creates a situation where the primary investigator has to be taken off the case, as does the prosecutor, and would not be able to testify. We have to create a whole separate team, a clean team on the prosecution side of it. So there are actually two solutions that we've been we put out a white paper 5 years ago about this. But there are two solutions that I would ask that you all consider as legislators. One is for each prosecutor's office to have the ability to independently investigate and prosecute the police from the start to the completion of a case. And that may sound simple, right? But it's not, because in the city of Baltimore, we don't have that authority. So in addition, and when you look at major municipalities throughout the country with this type of power, you look at Prince George's County, my colleague, Aisha Braveboy, who's doing a phenomenal job there, right? Just in office. She has the power of her investigators having police powers. You look at Garrett County, you look at Dorchester County, that we're giving that authority through the state legislature. Unfortunately, in the city of Baltimore, we don't have that power. As a major municipality, that is a problem, right? A power to be able to execute search and seizure warrants, to serve subpoenas, and to ensure that we have police powers. We don't have that ability. And that's a problem. Number two, and which I think is incredibly, incredibly important, is that it's time to really rethink and revamp the outdated sort of internal affairs approach to police misconduct investigations, guys, right? The current internal affairs model is such that where police investigate their own colleagues for allegations of misconduct, and it's not fit for purpose. In my office, if there's a case where there's a potential conflict, we talked about this, if there's a potential conflict in the state's attorney's office where somebody in my office is being investigated, guess what I'm going to do automatically? I'm going to conflict that case out because nobody in my office should be investigating our own. It's just a natural conflict of interest. And so why are the police able to investigate and research and reach conclusions on people from the same agency as them? It doesn't make any sense. And no profession should be able to do that. We need an independent agency free from police conflicts of interest to work with local prosecutors. Now understand, there's a distinction. I am not saying that local prosecutors should not be able to do their job as the people have elected them to do and apply one standard of justice. What I'm saying is that the investigation phase of it, right, should be an independent agency. And so when you look across the country, we should approach this with the idea of improving our state system, producing better investigations, and engendering a process that the public can trust, as is the case. And other states are actually doing this, guys. So when you look at Georgia and Wisconsin and Connecticut and Utah and New York, they actually have independent investigatory agencies that work with the local prosecutors to arrive at what the prosecutorial decision should be in charging those cases. That is so critical. And that's what we should be looking for, right? That's number 3. We need to provide better whistleblower protections. One of the issues in the city of Baltimore, we have the stop snitching mentality, which is the home of witness intimidation. But I can tell you, based on my experience, unfortunately, that we also have a blue wall of silence, and that officers do not want to testify against their colleagues. And so we have to figure out ways in which officers who are fearing that they're going to have to speak up and being accused of a snitch, changing the current law to provide whistleblower protections, such as job protection, employee transfers to other departments, and mediations that will provide safeguards to those that are fearful about speaking up against their colleagues. It happened time and time again, and I can illustrate numerous officers where it happened in the Freddie Gray case. Number 4, when we're able to go to trial for police officers, it's in the hands of the defense right now in the city of Baltimore and in our state to decide if a trial will be tried by a judge or a jury. That's a problem. Guys, when we look at the federal system, and I know that people are like, oh, there's a 6th Amendment right. Yeah, there's a 6th Amendment right in confrontation, right? A jury trial right. But when we look at the federal system, when it comes to electing a bench trial where you think that you're going to get deferential treatment from a judge, right? The prosecutor and the judge have a say in whether or not that should take place. Not in the state of Maryland. What federally in the state of Maryland, that's the case. We should conform to what's happening on the federal standards. Because what often happens in these police misconduct cases is that these officers will elect a bench trial over a jury trial and will not be accountable to the community that they represent. When it comes to number 5, repeal of LEABOR, and this is being proposed at least on the Senate level, and I think that this is a consideration that you guys need to really think about, right? It must be easier to hold rogue police officers accountable for their actions. And my office, unfortunately, has been playing cleanup to one of the largest police corruption scandals in the history of this country, where there were rogue police officers planting guns and drugs on citizens for decades. We have had to get rid of thousands of cases. And thanks to your support in the legislature, we've created laws that will allow vacatur, ability for prosecutors to go in the interest of justice and fairness, to be able to remove these unjust convictions. But what I need you guys to understand is the importance of repealing LEABOR and how it ties the hands of the police commissioner to get rid of bad officers. So the commissioner has testified before you all and it has stated that he needs the authority to fire problematic officers in a letter that the state legislature and Baltimore Police Department officials outlined the many problems with Leah Moore in terms of terminating staff. I will just tell you that we agree that the problems exist. The commissioner should be given that flexibility. There are officers that have been convicted of misdemeanors that pertain to their credibility that are still on the payroll in the city of Baltimore. Guess what? My office is not calling them, but they're still getting paid by the citizens and the taxpayers of the city of Baltimore. So if you look at the George Floyd case, that officer had 18 internal affairs convictions or complaints. One of the things that we've done in the city of Baltimore is we've opened that process up, right? Despite contention and never getting any sort of credit from the other side, but we have one of the most transparent IA records and policies in the country. We allow you to come in, look at it. You can look at whatever is on the internal affairs records. We'll argue admissibility in court, but we don't have anything to hide. But what prevents us from being able to publish credibility issues or publish a do not call list where we clearly never intend to call that officer is the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. That's what's preventing us from being able to publish this information that the public needs to know. We need you to address this issue. It's a major issue. Furthermore, when it comes to the current laws that prevent us from publicizing, as I stated, from the list of officers we believe have integrity issues, the Court of Appeals has ruled that police records relating to investigations of misconduct by police officers are personnel records under the MPIA and therefore cannot be disclosed. The MPIA should be amended to allow such disclosure. Furthermore, because police misconduct is currently a misdemeanor, officers remain on the payroll even when incarcerated. Changing misconduct to a felony would enable speedier dismissal, but this must also be coupled with reform that makes it easier for police commissioners to get rid of problematic officers. Misconduct should be a statutory felony crime with a defined sentence. There are instances where the police have not been forthright about a crime and the statute of limitations has expired. Changing misconduct from a common law misdemeanor to a statutory felony would result in a statute of limitations as opposed to the 2-year statute that now exists. We need the legislature to specify the sentence so we can have equal justice on these cases across the jurisdictions and courtrooms. I have 2 more points. Number 7, we need a system to share information on misconduct across the state. Someone with integrity issues for misconduct in Baltimore City should not end up working for Anne Arundel County a few weeks later. The governor's office should house a database on police misconduct that police departments and prosecutors can add to and access. Number 8, all these ideas for reform will be worth noting if you can deal. And I think that this is also an issue that we need to address. The police unions. I don't know how you do it. I don't know what you do to go about this process, legislators, but I need to let you know that they have too much power and they give the labor movement a bad name. They should be able to negotiate over salaries and benefits, but not over the minutia of disciplinary proceedings or how you can interview an officer in misconduct investigations. You as legislators would not consider tackling climate change, right, without dealing with the oil companies. In the same vein, if you're serious about police reform, you must tackle the police unions. We've seen over the years, and even this year, they will fight reform tooth and nail at every point. And I urge you to be bold, brave, and to do what's best in our state. Consider limiting their power because they are responsible for exacerbating the toxicity of political division, not just in the state of Maryland, but throughout this country. And finally, number 9, there should be a civilian majority on the Civilian Review Board and administrative hearings. Administrative hearings on police misconduct often take place before a panel stacked with former officers, leading to a biased outcome. Ordinary citizens who fund the police through their taxes need to have more of a say when it comes to these types of proceedings. Civilians should have the majority on such boards. Prosecutors, and last but certainly not least, this was brought up, and I want to make sure that we address this. And I believe it was Delegate Acevedo. Prosecutors should be assessing the types of crimes we're prosecuting. You're absolutely right. The reduction of unnecessary police violence is something that we should be assessing. No, it was Delegate Moon. And we need to be making those assessments every single day, which is why in 2019, I came out and said that we weren't prosecuting mere possession of marijuana. When you look at the COVID policies that we've implemented in the city of Baltimore, we're not prosecuting mere possession of CDS and prostitution. We have to stop relying on police for every social ill of society. And I think that it begins with you all on a statewide level. And if you all have not gotten the opportunity because of COVID and the global pandemic that we're facing to implement those types of laws, it's also incumbent on the prosecutors to do our job. George Floyd lost his life over an alleged counterfeit $20 bill during a global pandemic in order to buy groceries. Eric Garner lost his life because he allegedly sold loose cigarettes. Sandra Bland lost her life because, God forbid, she failed to put on a turn signal. Right? Like, these are minor minutia. Like this is the minute sort of trivial offenses that Black people in this country should not be losing their lives over. And so we have a responsibility and an obligation, as do you, to change what's happening and what has happened in this country for centuries. And with that, I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to speak with each and every one of you. My Chief Deputy, Michael Schatzow, and my Deputy over Public Trust and Police Integrity, Janice Bledsoe, is also on the call, should you have any specific questions.
Thank you. Thank you, State's Attorney Mosby. We do have a couple of questions, although you may have answered them. Delegate Acevedo had a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, State's Attorney Mosby, for your presentation and the concrete recommendations. I just want to echo your comments about organizations like the FOP and the labor movement. But I want to just turn to the case of Anton Black here, and I keep coming back to that because, as I've said time and again, Anton Black's death on the Eastern Shore has sort of exposed the inadequacies in state laws as it relates to police transparency and accountability, but particularly as it relates to the role of state's attorneys and prosecutors in bringing charges against officers who use excessive or deadly force when it isn't justified or a life is taken or snuffed out. We see the case with Anton Black, where the state's attorney declined to bring charges against all the officers involved, the state's attorney for Caroline County. And while it was good hearing that, your office has brought a number of cases against alleged misconducts, you're the exception and not the rule. And the issue that the public have is, well, one, not only this appearance of supposed conflict of interest with, the relationship between law enforcement and local state's attorneys, but the fact that, as I said earlier, the prosecution rate of law enforcement officers nationally are very low, right? You see state's attorneys, district attorneys. So, while I applaud the work of your office, would you suggest then, because it seems to me, because we do not have a statewide use of force standard with criminal implications, that would in essence allow state's attorneys and prosecutors to then bring charges based on those standards. That is in part the reason why we don't see a number of these charges or indictments being brought down. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on if we do look at a use of force standards, which I think we need to, what should the criminal implications be as it relates to the standard and when use of force is appropriate. I'd really be interested in that, because it seems to me like that is, I don't want to say impediment, but something that's missing from this equation here.
So Delegate, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that we do need a standard statewide use of force policy that emphasize the sanctity of life and de-escalation policies that we have in the city of Baltimore. I agree with you wholeheartedly, but I think we have to be very, very careful, right? When we talk about taking away the discretion of the local prosecutor, because we're talking about removing that and giving that to an appointed position that is given by a political sort of person that is appointing that person. Right? That's when it becomes political. If you do not do your job and you're not basing the decision and your discretion on the laws that you are guided by, guess what ends up happening? You are voted out. And that is how we have accountability. That is how we have the checks and balances, right? Like you look at St. Louis, you look at Chicago, when those local prosecutors failed to do their job, the community responded and voted them out of office. And so when we talk about placing that with an appointed position, you don't have that checks and balances anymore. So if they start making political decisions and based upon their party affiliation, there's no way for you to get them out of office. There's no way for you to stop them from making those political decisions. And so I get that we want that level of transparency, but I think that what we have to do is we have to emphasize, we do on a statewide basis, change those use of force policies so that we're all starting from the same place. And when those prosecutors don't use their discretion in a way that the community wants them to represent their values, then they're voted out.
Delegate Acevedo, did you have a follow-up? I think he's muted.
Yes, no, I agree that there should be electoral ramifications, and that, you know, the community should certainly hold their state's attorneys accountable. We just look at a number of cases where, you know, there was a loss of life and charges weren't brought, and these various state's attorneys have, you know, their reason as to why. But what's clear is that with a lack of use of force standard and criminal implications, right? You know, so if an officer does use force when it is not warranted or justified, you know, that would give state's attorneys that bandwidth then, right? Because in my own county, you know, it's Montgomery County, you know, we see the deaths of Robert White, Fanan Burhair, Emmanuel Okatuga from, you know, some years ago. And, you know, while charges weren't brought, you see the communities obviously saying, well, look, why, when we hear and we see footage and instances of where, you know, this could have been handled differently, that this person is dead and there's no kind of a charges being brought and no kind of accountability as it relates to the criminal legal system. So what I want to get at, yes, is certainly like, you know, I do believe we need a use of force standards, but there should be criminal implications with those use of force standards, and would love to get your thoughts.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And if they're not applied, then guess what you can do? You can get them out of position to make those individuals that aren't making those decisions out of office. I think that's the best checks and balances that we have. And I don't want us to lose sight of that. I mean, I know that we're trying to be transparent. We want this to be wholly independent, but the part of it is not necessarily if the issue that we have is the prosecutorial discretion. Guess what you can do? You can vote that person out of office. The issue that I'm telling you that we have as prosecutors is not at the prosecutorial level, at least for me. It's at the police investigative level. And at the investigative level, we need that independence. And so there's a distinction between the prosecutorial independence and the investigative independence. As a prosecutor, we are charged. We take an oath where we swear on a Bible, where we have to apply one standard of justice to everyone. It doesn't matter that we work with these individuals day in and day out, right? Like, we are charged with doing our job and doing the job that the people have elected us to do. And so I just want us to be very careful. I agree with you wholeheartedly. There should be a statewide standard of use of force policies that need to be implemented, that the prosecutor can gauge to determine whether or not they're going to prosecute. But when they don't do their job, this is the only checks and balances that we have, is to ensure that it is on a local level and that those local communities can hold those individuals accountable.
Are there any other questions from members of the committee? Okay, thank you. Thank you, State's Attorney Mosby, for joining us today. Thank you.
No, thank you guys. Appreciate you all.
David, Delegate Moon, did you have a question? No? Okay. So with that, we are going to move on to a briefing with the Office of the Public Defender. And with us is Zain Shirazi, and if I correct me when you come on, please, from the Charles County's office, Chastity Simpson from the Lower Eastern Shore, and Deborah Katz Levi, Director of Special Litigation in Baltimore City. So with that, I will let the first presenter take it over.
Thank you, Delegate Atterbury. My name is Zain Shirazi. I'm a public defender who has been serving in Charles County for the last 5 years. And I'm a witness to the many police abuses that have occurred and continue to occur in Charles County. Yes, even in our medium-sized jurisdiction with a leader among Maryland law enforcement, police abuse is widespread, undisclosed, and unaddressed. Let me give you a few examples of this police abuse in Charles County from just the last several years. As a caveat, none of these examples involve police in schools. We unfortunately are not addressing that issue today. It is a significant area where reform is direly needed, and the Office of the Public Defender would be happy to provide testimony on that issue another day. In a 2015 incident in Charles County, an officer who, according to the Washington Post, had been involved in 3 separate police shootings in Prince George's County, then joined the Charles County Sheriff's Office and shot a Black man. Out of the many officers with weapons on the scene at this Charles County incident, he was the only one who fired. The year after this shooting, the officer received an award. A Black man who was completely drunk with a 0.3 blood alcohol level was standing with a knife, his body swaying back and forth. 2 officers approached him. One of those officers shot him. The officer said the man lunged at him. The evidence, including the fact that this man was so drunk, suggested that the man was unable to keep his balance. On another incident, officers approached a Black man with knives. He was outside the distance the Charles County Sheriff's Office considers the safe zone for people with knives. But one officer entered that zone, moved towards the man, and then shot him. None of these police shootings have resulted in any sort of thorough or transparent investigation that the community could put any faith in whatsoever. More recently, and in addition to police use of deadly force, we have numerous examples of police use of non-lethal force that similarly go under-investigated and are very much egregious. Just this year, I myself represented a Black girl who was pepper sprayed for defending herself from the attacks of another girl, and then forced to sit with the pepper spray still in her eyes and hair without getting it washed out. The internal use of force investigation said there was no dash cam footage to review. There definitely was dash cam footage. An officer tackled a Black woman on a traffic charge because she was upset, not violent, just upset that her car was being towed. And look, I take the point well that the attorney-client privilege prevents me from giving details on many of these examples, and that prevents Sheriff Berry, for example, from being able to explain them or give law enforcement side. With that in mind, we have 2 videos of police uses of force on Black men in Charles County that are completely and wholly unjustifiable. We have permission to share these videos with this committee. We have provided them to you, we believe so. If you haven't been able to open them, I'm happy to continue trying to provide them, but we have provided them to you. We're hoping to share them during this presentation, but I think technical difficulties have prohibited that. But videos such as the ones that we have shared with you show the complete lack of oversight or accountability under the current system. Just like we cannot expect the police to police themselves, we can't expect the local prosecutors who work every day with these officers to actually charge them, just as you pointed out earlier, Delegate Atterbury. We know for a fact that the Charles County State's Attorney's Office is aware of the videos that we have shared with you, but they have not taken any action against the officers who used obvious and indefensible excessive force. Sheriff Berry has told this committee that the police have oversight in the form of the local prosecutors. I cannot emphasize enough how wrong that statement is. It's just not realistic. Police use of force is tearing our communities apart. And it's not just deadly use of force. Any police force traumatizes. Our Black communities far and away receive the brunt of the police use of force. That creates racial trauma and it creates distrust. Worse yet, police officers so often charge the people who they use force against. Everyone in the examples that I've provided today was charged with a crime. Charging people makes it so the now criminal defendant isn't in a position to file a complaint or cooperate with an investigation while their charges are pending. And by the time their cases are disposed of, they're often too tired, too beat down, and have seen just how biased the entire criminal legal system is to think it's even worthwhile to file a complaint that's going to be handled internally. I am glad this committee has come together. It has a lot of work to do. Maryland's criminal legal system protects police officers who use unnecessary and excessive force. At the same time, it relies on these same police officers to respond to everything from mental health crises to substance abuse issues to health emergencies to insignificant traffic enforcement. So what reforms can be achieved to help fix policing and help repair our communities? We need to repeal the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. With great power must come great oversight. With police officers, even though we give them immense power on our streets and in our communities, we provide almost no oversight, allowing the police to police themselves. That has to stop. We need a statewide use of force policy that prioritizes de-escalation, prohibits the use of force in certain circumstances, such as to resolve something more quickly, and allows the use of deadly force only as a last resort and only when necessary. Delegate Fisher and Delegate Acevedo, I think you were pointing out that this was needed. And I would urge this committee to look at creative ways that it can help move counties away from the police responding to incidents where sending perhaps a social worker may be a better approach, as Delegate Moon, you've pointed out. Sheriff Berry cites as a good thing the statistic that over 96% of the calls his officers respond to don't end in an arrest. That's over 1 million calls where social workers, substance abuse counselors, or mental health providers are needed instead of police officers. Having police respond to more incidents only increases the odds that there will be a negative and possibly violent interaction. And that in turn decreases trust in the police. Even if some sort of program that provides an alternative to police cannot be instituted at the state level, perhaps this committee can think creatively about how the state can incentivize counties to create such programs, maybe through funding. Sheriff Berry has promised more training for his officers. That's great, that's needed. But if training were all that were needed, the problems we're finally confronting would have never occurred or would have been easily dealt with years ago. We need to produce major systemic changes that will require police to avoid using force whenever possible, and that will provide the community the oversight and transparency it deserves. I thank this work group for its time, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. And next, Chastity Simpson from the Lower Eastern Shore.
Hi, thank you. I am the District Public Defender for the Lower Eastern Shore of Maryland. Thank you for letting me participate in this conversation today. It's a very important conversation, and I really appreciate that you're hearing our input on these issues. The counties that I supervise are all rural counties in Maryland, and I'd like to provide some examples of how our rural counties are just as affected by these issues, this lack of transparency and accountability of police officers, as our larger cities and suburbs of Maryland are. We've always recognized that there's potential problems with transparency and accountability on the Lower Eastern Shore, but the issues have very recently come to a head, so to speak. It was discovered recently that there was a problem in the Salisbury City Police Department evidence room, one that potentially dates back for more than 20 years. While working with a number of agencies to oversee that, we are helping participate in a complete forensic accounting of the property room, which is going to cost the taxpayers of this county or the city of Salisbury quite a bit of money to account for every single piece of property and how it was processed. And what has started as a suspected theft of money from the property room led to a discovery of a number of other issues. It was discovered that the property room appeared highly disorganized. They were not adhering to disposal schedules. And then it was revealed that there was yet another significant problem that involved several police officers that are still employed or were still employed by the Salisbury City Police Department. It's unclear to us at this point how compromised the property room may be. That issue was first identified in February of this year. And we won't know the full implications for many more months. That is really just beginning to be investigated. What we have learned so far through that investigation, though, is that there were 3 officers who were involved in hiding exculpatory evidence from the state's attorney's office back in 2012. There were finally some disclosures filed about this in 2020 when it was discovered by our current state's attorney's office. And those disclosures were made in every court file that they knew of that involved any of those 3 officers, both pending and closed cases. And in that disclosure, what was stated by the state's attorney's office was that the officers, quote, purposely attempted to conceal evidence. In 2012, while preparing for trial, the prosecutor who had those cases asked the officers about a piece of evidence, and it was revealed to her that they did in fact have that piece of evidence and that they did not write a report about when they collected it. They logged it into property and did not write a report that would have to be provided to the state's attorney's office because it would require them to reveal the confidential source that had provided it. So no report was written at that time. She requested that a report be written, is my understanding. One was written, but still didn't disclose that the items were purposely concealed or withheld from the state's attorney's office by those police officers. This case involved multiple co-defendants, some of whom pled guilty and went to jail for significant periods of time, one of whom was electing to go to trial, and that's how this issue was discovered. His case was ultimately dismissed, but without a disclosure of what really happened. The other co-defendants presumably were not told either what really happened. They have since received these disclosures in 2020, long after their case is closed, long after they have served significant jail time. When that information was disclosed in 2020, the Salisbury Police Department undertook an investigation of those 3 officers, an internal investigation. The local news reported here on May 7th of 2020 that the allegations of misconduct by 2 of those 3 officers was determined to be not sustained, and that the 3rd officer had retired. His investigation was not yet concluded. So despite these strong statements that were made about what is clearly misconduct by those officers in electing not to properly document evidence and not share that information with the state's attorney's office for some period of time during the course of this prosecution, their own agency found that they did nothing wrong, essentially. We don't really have an explanation at this stage of things as to how they come to that conclusion. I just believe it doesn't comport with the information that I know about what happened in those cases. I can only speculate that the 2 who were absolved were the road officers, essentially the detectives, and that the supervisor was who advised them to do this is the reason that they were absolved of any wrongdoing, because they were told by a supervisor that it was okay to do this or that this is what they should do. Their agency found that they did nothing wrong. And if that's the reason, it just speaks to a huge systemic issue within that police department and potentially within other police departments. If there's no documentation about what a supervisor advises someone in the course of an investigation, the supervisors typically don't write reports about what they're consulted about in an investigation with their support by their subordinates. And so that would never be revealed to the defense, to the person accused. It's also common practice that if an officer is wearing a body camera, here at least, the volume is turned off when they're interacting with one another. So you still wouldn't know through use of body camera that a supervisor advised someone to do something inappropriate. And apparently that would then absolve the officer who took that inappropriate action or could. In the aftermath of all of that, we learned that there is really no procedure or policy in place in our local state's attorney's offices for misconduct to be disclosed to the state's attorney. There are a lot of mechanisms through the Constitution and through state law that require that the state disclose information to the defense about the credibility of their witnesses, including police officers. Yet there's previously been no efforts made to acquire this information. And really, there's still no effort made yet to acquire that information. They are still telling us that we can't obtain that without obtaining a court order, without us asking for a court order, even though it's their obligation to disclose and find that information out and disclose it. And I believe Ms. Levy is going to address the legal process and how some of the case law is interpreted in Maryland and why this is really just unacceptable. We did some of our own research when we learned of these issues and found that the city had a website that listed the number of internal affairs investigations in a calendar year for several years and the outcome of those investigations. They didn't identify the officers or the nature necessarily of the complaint. We filed a Public Information Act request, and through that have learned just Tuesday of this week that there are 4 more disclosures forthcoming based on our Public Information Act request. So again, information that was never told to the state's attorney's office, never disclosed in any cases that involved these officers that are now going to be disclosed. And this is why the answer that we often get from prosecutors, that we don't have this information. The prosecutor doesn't have this information, so we can't disclose it. That's just an unacceptable answer. Even now in this county, knowing what their responsibilities are and knowing that their office is out in the community giving lip service to the idea of transparency, the reality is that the line attorneys aren't asking police officers if they've had any issues. They're not seeking the information that they're obligated to disclose. And they accuse us of being on a fishing expedition if we ask about these things. Everyone is hiding behind the law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights and privacy protections that are encompassed by that to withhold this information and not disclose it as they are required to do. I would also just add that some reforms that have previously been put in place, such as body cameras, are something that aren't perfect either. They aren't always achieving their intended goal because of a lack of accountability and a lack of transparency. Many of our local agencies do have body cameras. Unfortunately, the Maryland State Police do not all have cameras equipped in their cars or on their police officers. They previously had cameras on all of the cars with the Maryland State Police when I first became a public defender. But I think there was a lack of upkeep of those cameras as they broke. They just were never fixed. They weren't reinstalled. And so now they're one of the largest agencies in the area and have no consistent use of body cameras or in-car cameras. And even though a lot of our other agencies have them, when we receive that footage, and it is very time consuming to review, it is hours of footage, it appears that it's the police agency that's deciding what gets disclosed, at least here. The police officer or the police agency provides that footage to the state's attorney's office, and it's then disclosed to the defense. And we often find that there are large portions of the footage missing. You can see that an officer is already on scene when the footage begins. You can see that it stops before he is leaving the scene. And yet, it seems impossible to actually get the full footage of every single officer that's on scene in a stop. Officers can also elect to turn off their body cameras. They often are required by internal policies to turn them off if they're speaking with each other. It is not always consistently turned back on, even when interacting with other people on the scene. We have a known, I would say, problem officer in one of our counties who is not currently equipped with a body camera. He had a body camera. It broke, was the story I believe that I heard. And it's never been fixed. And while it may sound like a rumor or an anecdote, every client I ever interacted with in that county who interacted with that officer would say that he was the reason the agency got body cameras in the first place, that he has such negative interactions with people that he is the person who most needs a body camera on the entire police force there. And yet he is not held accountable for and he still does not have a body camera. Unfortunately, I think that the history here has been that when a serious problem exists with an officer, it may ultimately lead to the dismissal or departure of that officer from the agency that he works for. It's never really disclosed why. There's usually a decision by the state not to call that officer anymore for cases that are currently pending, but nothing ever happens with former cases of that officer. Nothing is disclosed to help the defense understand that there was an issue that may need to be addressed in post-conviction or by some other means. And then the officer often just moves to another county agency, goes to some other county in Maryland where no one knows his background, and he can start fresh at this new police agency with no one even questioning at that point that there is this history or this problem. Officers are not just employees, they're witnesses, and they shouldn't be protected more than other witnesses when it comes to their credibility. In most cases, the reality is that no matter how the judge instructs a juror, the community believes that police are held to higher standards, and they hold them to a higher standard, and they believe what they say more often than not. And I think that part of the reason they believe that is because our community probably believes that they are held to a higher standard, that they are vetted before they are handed a gun and a badge to patrol the streets of our counties, and that they should be believed for those reasons. I agree that many officers try to live up to the high standard that they should be held to. Many succeed, but it's a problem to protect those who don't succeed, to hide their failures, because it causes distrust in the entire institution. I think, in the many cases I've tried to a jury in my years of practice, jurors can accept that there's imperfections, that people aren't perfect, and they do so with lay witnesses all of the time. But what we shouldn't accept is a culture that hides what's wrong, hides imperfections, and hides problems, and doesn't hold those people accountable for those things. So I thank you for forming this work group and discussing these issues. I think some of the things we need, many of them have been talked about already by everyone else that's presented, but we need thorough, transparent investigations of officers. We need mandatory disclosures when an officer is investigated, regardless of the outcome, if it's an internal investigation, because that doesn't tell us the full story. We need proper vetting of hired police officers. We need transparency regarding their previous employment. There should be statewide standards for use of force and body cameras. And the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights should just be repealed. They shouldn't be able to hide behind these protections any longer. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I appreciate you listening to what we had to say.
Thank you. And next, Ms. Deborah Katz-Levi.
Thank you very much, Delegate Atterbury, and thank you to the committee for having us. The Public Defender's Office is honored to be a part of the discussion today. I will say, with two caveats, I apologize, A, for the new puppy in my background, and B, for the technological hiccups. Also, somebody's going to control my PowerPoint from some other place, probably in Annapolis, so bear with me as I ask that human being to forward slides. My name is Debbie Katz-Levy. I am the Director of Special Litigation in Baltimore City. The issues that you're talking about today are obviously so compelling for the nation and so compelling for our office. In fact, after I leave here today, I'm presenting to the Maryland Criminal Defense Association with an entire group from across the state of lawyers who are desperate to find ways to amend their practice in order to accommodate for police misconduct and police abuses. This morning, I spent the day with lawyers from across the state from OPD. We have selected lawyers who applied to be part of a courageous group of lawyers from every jurisdiction across the state to increase our practice and to increase transparency in the courtroom to the benefit of our clients. Next slide, please. Well, I come here today from Baltimore, and everybody in the room, and I think everybody who's listening, has probably heard at some point talk about the Gun Trace Task Force and their notorious work in Baltimore. Next slide, please. But the Gun Trace Task Force officers were only allowed to do what they did because of all of the minor transgressions that happened for decades, not just in the city of Baltimore, but everywhere in Maryland with police misconduct that is allowed to fester under the shroud of secrecy. The first officer who we really revealed or got into their files in Baltimore City was prior to Freddie Gray, prior to the Gun Trace Task Force officers. When we got into the secrets behind his internal affairs files, of which there were many, he lost his temper in the courthouse, and as you can see by this Baltimore Sun article, was banned from appearing again in the Baltimore City courthouse. Next slide, please. We then got into another officer's files And we were able to cross-examine this officer. And what was inside of those files were instances of abusive conduct, not just dishonesty, not just theft, not just evidence planting is what we're finding in these files, but this is a person who had a pattern of abusive conduct or concealing abusive conduct that was acted out through his colleagues. When we got into this officer's files, he also sort of somewhat lost his temper, refused to come back to court, and had to be subpoenaed by the state's attorney's office, and all of his cases were dismissed. This was before, next slide, please, we had entered into this agreement, or the state's attorney's office and the city solicitor's office had entered into this agreement. This slide, and then also the next one, is one of the orders we received from a judge when we litigated for 2 days access to this officer's file. If you can see, the numbers span between the last slide and this slide from 2007 to 2017. You toggle back and forth. When we finally got into this officer's files, this was the first time any of his internal affairs files had been disclosed, and they spanned a decade. Next slide, please. Because at that point, we were required to make something called a showing of the need to inspect. Now, I don't have my glasses, I don't have a big screen, but this is a quote from a judge in Colorado. Colorado, California, and New York recently changed their laws to increase transparency. But I think what this district court judge, Catherine Lemon, said is powerful. Internal affairs secrecy contributes to the code of silence or the blue wall by creating the expectation that things will be kept in-house and away from objective outsiders. Open access to internal affairs files enhances the effectiveness of internal affairs investigations rather than impairing them. Knowing that they will be scrutinized makes investigators do a better job and makes them and the department more accountable to the public. Next slide, please. This is a document of abuse that was made into the record. Now, I can show you only things that have made their way into the court record because under the Maryland Public Information Act, it is actually a crime to unlawfully distribute an internal affairs file. So I am limited in what I can tell to my colleagues and what I can tell to my clients who I represent, unless it makes it into the court record. In this particular case, an officer wanted to take a stand and we got to cross-examine him with records from his files. This was abuse towards young individuals who had come into Maryland to deliver brownies to a church, were pulled out of their car, were beaten by officers, and the supervising officer covered up those instances of abuse and then was disciplined for it. We didn't know that until many years later. Next slide, please. From this officer's file, we could see while he was executing a search warrant in apartment 303 in one building, he decided to help himself into apartment 301, take out his police-issued walkie-talkie and beat this individual to a pulp with nobody looking. He then called Crime Lab to take photos of it. That was in his internal affairs file. The judge ultimately ruled that we would be able to get that instance into the record during trial because this officer had a pattern and practice of abusive conduct towards young Black men when he looked overall at all of the files. Next slide, please. We are limited in getting our access to this information by filing something called a motion for subpoena for tangible evidence. In order for us to do that, we have to develop something called a need to inspect. In Baltimore, and Ms. Mosby spoke and said she doesn't get any credit from the other side. That's not true. We absolutely appreciate the effort that Ms. Mosby made, but we recognize our part in that as voracious criminal defense attorneys who repeatedly filed motion after motion after motion and insisted on transparency of records. And this information and the reason that we did it is not because we have a penchant for police officers. In fact, like Ms. Simpson said, we respect the officer who does a good job, but we had client after client after client who told us something horrible had happened to them. And so we went after those records because we believe that those records would highlight the misconduct. Next slide, please. Baltimore has come up with an agreement between the state's attorney's office and the city solicitors at the behest of the court, who called all of the parties together and said, please come up with a better solution to this. And while we have some great access, next slide, please, there are still problems even in Baltimore. Some of the problems in Baltimore is that we don't, for example, get access to open investigations. And I'm going to challenge the committee at the end of all of this information gathering, And you all have been ferocious in your information gathering. And I applaud the amount of hearings that you have had and the many hours you all have maintained your attention and been able to sit and listen to representatives from across the board in Maryland. And you should commend yourselves. It is sincere, and I believe you are doing your best to do a good job. As you do that, I think your challenge is going to be not agreeing that there's going to be, whether there's going to be change and more access to police files in Maryland, but how is that access going to look? I think at the end of the day, everybody's going to arrive at the solution or the conclusion that this has to change. And your challenge will be, where on the pendulum do we fit with all of the other states who have adopted? And 30 states have adopted greater access to police internal affairs files than Maryland, 30 states. So what we're looking at still in Maryland is that in Baltimore is that open investigations are not regularly disclosed, and disclosure rises and falls and turns oftentimes on individual prosecutors. And it even turns on the individual elected prosecutor in Baltimore. Right now, we are fortunate to have a progressive prosecutor who gives us tremendous access. We don't want to lose that access if she decides to move on to another position and then doesn't get reelected. And then we are at the whim of the next prosecutor who doesn't believe in what she believes in. We need your help in the legislature to make this uniform, consistent, and part of Maryland's culture. Next slide. To show you how important it is to find access to an open investigation, this is a screenshot of a body camera. And what you can see on the right and the left, if you look very closely, are two arms reaching up into a trash dumpster, retrieving a weapon in a homicide case. Next slide, please. We didn't understand why the officer who we saw in the body camera finding the gun was Caucasian, but the police documents indicated that the man who found the gun is the officer on the right-hand side who's African-American. We couldn't figure out why that would be. This was a homicide case where the individual who was not named in discovery found a gun. Next slide, please. We zoomed in on the body camera. We Googled his name. He was currently being investigated and prosecuted for perjury. It was an open investigation that nobody told us about. Guess what he lied about? Finding a gun. Can you imagine having a family member in a criminal prosecution presumed innocent in a murder and not being told that the officer who allegedly found the gun in your case is being prosecuted for lying about finding a gun in another case? Open investigations have to be disclosed. Reasonable redactions are allowed to be made, we believe, but there has to be a level of transparency that we haven't yet met. Next slide, please. I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I've given you likely more slides than I'm going to be able to get into today. But the state of the law in Maryland revolves around a case called Fields versus State, 432 Maryland 650, 2013. A unanimous decision from the Court of Appeals written by Judge Barbera with the concurrence by Judge McDonald. This is the case we all refer to when we look to internal affairs files. There are constitutional precepts that cover the right to discovery, the need for prosecutors to disclose fully impeachment information, information that goes to innocence. But we take law enforcement internal affairs files for some reason and put them in a very separate category. The reason is because we have the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights and the MPIA, which have very little to do with the criminal defendant's access to fairness and full access to internal affairs files. In that case, one lawyer asked through discovery for documents to be turned over. It was a theft scheme, a felony theft scheme that some Baltimore police officers had engaged in, and it was kept secret from the prosecution, from the defense, and these officers were testifying. Nonetheless, when the court goes to analyze whether they get these records, the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals says, look, let's look first at whether the records are protected under the MPIA, and let's look at the LEOBR. And these officers get all kinds of protections, so maybe criminal defendants don't have access to those files on the regular. There was no MPIA request in that case and no petition that had anything to do with LEOBR. Nonetheless, that's what the court looks to for guidance in order to determine whether or not a criminal defendant gets rights to these records. Now, I want to add, and I know I'm talking to some attorneys and not some attorneys, but I just want to make this case to the work group that law enforcement officers, when they are part of a case, they are a witness like any other. They take the stand, they fill out affidavits, their truthfulness is important. if they have a history of lying, if they have a history of being untruthful, if they have a pattern of abusive conduct, all of that is required to be disclosed to the defense. And we need a regular formula for regular disclosure. What I know to be true from practicing in Maryland, and I came from another jurisdiction. I grew up here in Montgomery County, but I practiced in Baltimore City and I practiced in the state of Utah. What I know to be true is there is no place in Maryland that has a regular process for each and every line attorney to review an internal affairs file for every officer to see if it needs to be disclosed. Even in Baltimore, it is housed in a centralized unit, not the individual prosecutor who has to assess the strength of their case. And what we need is every prosecutor to fulfill their duty and every prosecutor to seek those records out and review them. I just recently litigated a case in Frederick where we were seeking access to the officer's internal affairs files. And like it happens every time, the prosecutor showed up and said, I don't know what's in there. I haven't looked at the file. They hadn't looked at the file. This is a routine occurrence that they will call a witness. When the law says that the prosecutor is required to seek out this information and hand it over to the defense, the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court says the prosecutor has an obligation to seek out information, even as it relates to the police, even if it creates an insurmountable hurdle, even if it creates an inefficiency for your agency, you have to do it. And they still come every day and they don't do it. Part of the deterrence, besides the fact that there's the LEOBR, which protects police officers, and think about it and peruse the code. What other profession in the state of Maryland has a Bill of Rights? The only Bill of Rights we should all have is the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. That's enough. That's enough for the officers, like it's enough for the general public. That's the only Bill of Rights that we need. I always want to say court's indulgence when I'm talking to you, which is what I would ask for the court to give me just one brief second. I'm going to fast forward through some of the legal slides. I'm going to leave them there for your perusal later. But I just want to say, before I move on to the last section of my slides, is that in Fields versus State, the Court of Appeals of Maryland requires that lawyers develop what's called the need to inspect. We have to show the court there's a reasonable possibility that the files will lead to the discovery of usable evidence. How do I get to the need to inspect unless I can see the files that you're hiding behind lock and key? How do I tell the court there's something in there about him stealing unless I can see that 14 people have claimed across the city or the state or Charles County or Frederick County that this officer has a history of stealing? How do you get to hide that from me and then give us the burden to come up with it in order to demonstrate the need to get into the files? If you could go to slide 31. In 2015, a study was done by WNYC that looked at access to internal affairs files across the country. At that time, 23 states held back access to records. Maryland was one of them, as was New York, California, and Colorado. In the last 5 years, New York, California, and Colorado have changed their laws to develop access to internal affairs files for the general public. Maryland should be no exception and should hop on that trend of exposing files to criminal defendants and to the general public. As my colleague Brian Sassenti said in one of our cases where we were litigating, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The reason we are seeing people be murdered like George Floyd is because for so long these abuses are allowed to persist under the shroud of secrecy. Could you imagine if your family member went to a surgeon and that surgeon had operated on the wrong leg of a human being and you were not allowed to know that because that was a secret personnel file? Could you imagine if you wanted to have a lawyer who you hired for your son's case or your case and they had 6 sustained complaints with attorney grievance and you weren't allowed to know that because somebody considered that to be an employee record? It's unconscionable. that law enforcement officers who are allowed to carry deadly weapons as part of their government-issued uniform are allowed to perpetrate misconduct in secrecy. And I ask, as you move forward, to not just open the veil of transparency, next slide, please, but to make it as broad as you possibly can. I would direct your attention as you go back and make decisions on how broad you want this to be, to look at this article for which I cited in my documents for you. The Vox.com article does sort of an expose on movements throughout the nation on access to internal affairs files. And finally, my last slide. In looking at the movement to open transparency in internal affairs files, I don't think it should be lost on anybody. As Adika Pimentel, a lead organizer with the advocacy group Make the Road in New York, said, that low-income and Black and Brown communities are familiar with abusive officers, but without access to their histories of misconduct, we are unable to look at patterns of officers who are continuously beating people up in the community. We can no longer let this type of abuse persist in secrecy. There is no harm in transparency. There is no policy in favor of covering it up that is sustainable any longer. The reason for LEOBR is gone, and MPIA has no place in litigation. With that, I urge you to reach out to agencies and states across the country who have favored more transparency and open up records as much as you possibly can so that we can add that into our statewide database and hopefully the statewide database that the government and the prosecution decide to develop as well. With that, I would submit. Thank you. To questions.
Thank you, and thank you all of us from the Office of the Public Defender for one. I always feel like I need to apologize for those that are the last panel because you've waited for so long. So thank you very much. I'll start, and if any other members have questions, please let me know. I'm gonna circle back to independent investigations, and you all touched on it briefly. And my question is, do you have an opinion as to what is the appropriate place for, if this work group decides that independent investigations is appropriate for police officer shootings that result in death or serious bodily injury or whatever we determine? Do you have an opinion as to where they should be housed? And do you think that as the state's attorneys differentiated between independent investigations and independent prosecutions, are you making that distinction, or do you think they both should be treated similarly?
Zane and Chastity, do you mind if I go first in that response?
Yes.
We have absolutely no objection to an independent agency to investigate and prosecute police officers. I myself represent an individual named Keith Davis who was shot by the police 33 times. The police department investigated that shooting to determine whether the use of force was reasonable in Mr. Davis's case. The same police officers who work side by side protecting each other's lives are asked to examine whether that shooting was reasonable. The answer that the prosecutors gave today was that homicide detectives know best, and homicide detectives know how to investigate those kinds of cases. So then recruit homicide detectives either in the AG's office or in the special prosecutor's office that investigates election fraud. They have the power to investigate more, to prosecute more. And I think that you could staff any agency with the best from around the state that would know reasonableness for use of force and would have no direct allegiance to the people with whom they are investigating.
And did you want to, anyone else want to chime in, or?
I just
go ahead.
want to add that being from a rural jurisdiction, one of the things that I think we should think about too is that there is sort of a magnification of relationships between the prosecutors and the police officers when you're in such a small jurisdiction. I think if you're talking about Baltimore City, where there's hundreds of officers that are reporting and hundreds of prosecutors who are working with those officers, you may not build as close a relationship with individual officers. There may be, it's certainly going to be less common, I think, with that many people being involved. But in a smaller jurisdiction where there are 20 prosecutors dealing with or in some of our offices, there are 4 or 5 prosecutors in the entire office, they know every single police officer that works in their county, and they know them well, and they socialize with them. And I mean, I know many of them. I, work with the same officers over the course of my career, and I've been in every single county at one point or another, and I may know some better than others based on how long I'm in a particular county, but it's a small town. Everyone knows everyone. So I think that problem that was identified earlier of a conflict between the officers that they work with every day being prosecuted by that office is very real in a small jurisdiction.
I had that exact question, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that because, for example, in Charles County, where you don't have that many prosecutors, they're generally going to be familiar with all of the police officers. They're going to have worked with these police officers in the past. They're going to know these police officers, and they've tried cases with these police officers and relied on their investigations. And they're already going to be colored and biased in sometimes small ways to sort of want to protect these police officers. And so having some sort of independent body, and it's really important to repeal the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights so that an internal investigation by the police is not happening. That you first have an independent investigation, and then if prosecution is needed, that you have that prosecution, and that be done independently. And like Chastity said, perhaps in a larger jurisdiction like Baltimore City, where you have at the time a progressive state's attorney who's willing to take those prosecutions, that's going to be okay. But what this legislature really needs to think about is what's going to happen in the future if you don't have a progressive attorney anymore. And that's why there really needs to be broad scale systemic changes to ensure that no matter who's in power, that the system itself will be able to manage police officer misconduct. And then I just wanted to add as a last thing, looking at investigations after the misconduct has already occurred, that sort of back-end accountability is important. Don't lose sight of how important front-end accountability is. So having a statewide use of force policy that says to officers, hey, do not use force, deadly force, unless it's absolutely necessary as a last resort, and it's needed to protect some other people's lives. To have that sort of front-end accountability so that we don't have to have another death, another police shooting, another body that we have to mourn over is really, really critical. So focusing on not just the back-end accountability, but also very much focusing on that front end so that we can prevent some of this stuff.
Thank you. Delegate Acevero has a question, and then Delegate Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the presenters for your recommendations, etc. I have a question that I think it's very much related to the discussion that we're having right now. We know that police or law enforcement is the first point of contact for the criminal legal system. And when we talk about, SROs, school resource officers, or police in schools, and the juvenile, the school to prison pipeline, and the amount of arrests that take place, particularly amongst Black, Latinx students with disabilities and LGBTQ students, with the presence of police, I'm curious to hear from OPD. Those of you who have clients that you've represented, whether it's before DJS or before the courts, the experiences, any experiences that you can share with, your interactions with law enforcement, etc. If anyone can share that, because I think it's very much related to the topic that we're talking about here, and when we look at the data time and again, whether it's from the U.S. Department of Education or other organizations, that the presence of law enforcement in schools, how that disproportionately impacts certain populations. I'm curious to see what the experience is or what you all have been seeing or hearing with young people, kids, juveniles in the criminal legal system.
So we have a juvenile defenders division that is prepared to address the juvenile. We agree with you 100%. In fact, I was a former teacher in Baltimore City before I went to law school. We have significant issues with children of color, and with the school to prison pipeline. But I do want to invite our folks who are experts in the juvenile issues, because they are very different than adult court issues, to talk at in greater detail for that. And so I know we have offered to come back and speak about that at another date. Juvenile laws are different. Juveniles are respondents, not defendants. Cases move much more quickly and they have a much different set of rules. And while we are all deeply passionate about that, I want to make sure that we're giving you the best information possible.
Yeah, if I can just add, it's a really important topic, and we need to stop policing our schools and policing students the way we are. And I hope this work group can have a separate session that's devoted to that entirely, because it's such an important topic, and OPD would be happy to have people who specialize in juvenile defense, who dedicate all of their time to doing that, who know the school resource officers and the issues there. I will say that in Charles County, from what I know, is that almost every single juvenile case involves a Black defendant, a Black juvenile. And Charles County is about half Black, half white. That disproportionality should affect all of us. We should all be stunned by something like that. And yet we've come to be, that's sort of the norm, and we've come to accept that. And that needs to stop. And now's the time for that to stop. What has happened in schools is not necessarily that some of the conduct is that different. It's that what we are penalizing and policing has changed. And so, I've had cases where there are students who have now turned 18, but they're in district court charged with assault for getting into a fight in a school that doesn't result in any sort of serious injuries or anything like that. But that in the past would have been dealt with just internally in the school, but now it's also being dealt with in a criminal court. And there's a lot of things wrong with that. And I would urge this work group to look specifically at that, and we'd be happy to on another day provide testimony that looks specifically at that.
Okay, Delegate Davis.
Hey, thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you all for being here today and sharing your firsthand experiences. It's really important to have those. The challenge that we have as a task force is the presentations that we had before are from all progressive state's attorneys from progressive counties. And so when we hear about what's happening in the rural counties, we have to address those counties also, including Charles County. We have to address those counties earlier. I want to turn my attention specifically to state's attorneys and or police officers withholding information, especially exculpatory information in criminal cases. I'd like to first talk about what the penalty is, and then what do you think should be the penalty or how we should address it?
I think the current penalty is, there's no criminal penalty, and they may lose their job. They could theoretically lose their license to practice law. I think as of this date, the investigation in question in Salisbury has only resulted in the prosecutor losing her job. The officers are all employed and or retired, and she is the one who ultimately brought it to light. But she is actually facing consequences for what happened. The police aren't, which is disturbing to me. I'm not here to decide who's getting, whose consequences are fair or not, but everyone should have consequences for what happened.
So I'll chime in also, if I may, Chastity, that you ask a very good question. And a lot of times we focus on the retribution. So there's always the misconduct in office charge that you could charge a police officer with. I guess you could charge with obstruction of justice. Prosecutors are very rarely prosecuted. They have something called the special duties of prosecutors. It's an ethical rule that you could file a complaint against a prosecutor for violating the special duties of prosecutors. But this notion about I think the question touches on whose responsibility is it? How much is it for the prosecutor to seek it out? And how much is the responsibility for the police department to disclose it? There was a story in the paper yesterday, I think that was out of Harford County, right, with the prosecutor who withheld the information. And I had said earlier that I wanted to talk about the Supreme Court. And I just want to say that this is a decision that we use a lot because it's such a good question and people look at it in terms of efficiency. Well, whose responsibility is it and how much work do people have to do? And this is from Kyles versus Whiteley, 514 U.S. 419, 1995. And the Supreme Court, in that case, Louisiana, the state of Louisiana held back some information and they came up to the court and they said, look, we're just a prosecutor's office in a big state and we can't get all that information. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not the answer. The standard is so high in this country. And they said, quote, this in turn means that the individual prosecutor has a duty to learn of any favorable evidence known to others acting on the government's behalf, including the police. And it means that you can't use, it says the state of Louisiana would prefer an even more lenient rule. It says that this information wasn't even disclosed to the prosecutor until after trial. And the Supreme Court said it suggested that it should not be held accountable if the evidence was known only to the police. And the Supreme Court said to accommodate the state in this manner would, however, amount to a serious change of course from the Brady line of cases. So the Supreme Court said, we are not lessening our standard. You go do your due diligence. It's not enough to just say, well, they didn't tell me. You seek it, you show up, you ask every day. And if they don't disclose it, you see that discipline is taken out against that officer with some kind of holding of accountability. So we should never look at how we're lessening the standard and pointing the finger and saying, well, they didn't tell me. The job and the follow-up needs to come from also looking at prosecutors and police officers who withhold that information.
Yeah, I'll just add, you know, the entire criminal legal system needs reform. I think people have been speaking about that for a long time, and I hope that now is the political moment where some of that reform will actually occur, and hopefully all of the reform that we need will occur. I know right now this work group is focused on police reform and accountability. That's so important because that's a life and death question right at the outset. There is so much reform needed, including with our courts and how they function, and how whether judges are dismissing cases for a prosecutor's failure to bring exculpatory information or not, or what penalties other than that a prosecutor may personally face when they are purposefully, for example, hiding information. A lot of that needs to be discussed as well, and I hope this work group continues working on some of these other issues as well.
Are there any other questions from members of the work group? Okay, seeing none, I want to thank again the Office of the Public Defender for being here. I want to thank the Maryland State's Attorneys Association representatives, State's Attorney Gibson, Brave Boy, and McCarthy for being here. And also I want to thank State's Attorney Mosby for presenting as well. Thank you again to the work group members for your participation in today's briefing. And that concludes